She ruined this family the second she walked in. My sister screamed as she shoved my suitcase out into the pouring rain. I slept in my car that night, wondering how the little girl I gave up my 20s to raise could hate me with such vicious intensity. But exactly 7 days later, my phone lit up at 2 a.m. "Please answer," she sobbed, her voice cracking with pure terror. "They are tearing the house apart because of what I did with your name." I barely had time to process her panic before the blinding red and blue lights of a federal transport vehicle flooded my windshield and a badge was pressed against my glass. "My name is Harper. I am 32 years old, and to my family, I was just a boring, invisible accountant who only existed to balance their checkbooks and fund their luxury lifestyles." The night my sister threw me out the Chicago sky was breaking open with a massive freezing thunderstorm. I had been staying in their sprawling 6-bedroom mansion for exactly 4 days. A burst water main had completely destroyed my modest apartment, leaving me nowhere else to go. You would think sacrificing my own youth and working 3 jobs to put Jessica through college would earn me a few weeks of grace. But her recent marriage to Marcus changed everything. Marcus was a charismatic African-American tech founder whose flashy startup was supposedly the next big thing. In their new high society world, I was nothing but a peasant. The final breaking point happened over a simple dinner. I had just spent 3 grueling hours on my feet cooking a massive multi-course meal they demanded for their friends. When I finally sat down at the edge of the kitchen and quietly mentioned how exhausted I was from working a double shift at my firm, Jessica slammed her crystal wine glass onto the marble island. "You are so pathetic, Harper," she yelled, her face contorting with absolute disgust. "You bring this broke, depressing energy everywhere you go, and I am sick of it. You do not belong here. Get out." Before I could even speak a word in my defense, she marched upstairs, grabbed my only suitcase, and dragged it down the grand staircase. She shoved it out the front door, sending my clothes spilling onto the soaking wet lawn. I stepped out into the freezing rain, my clothes instantly sticking to my skin, and looked back at the porch. Marcus was leaning casually against the grand stone pillar, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He was actually smirking at me. A second later, the flashing lights of a local patrol car pulled into the driveway. Marcus had called the police to report an unwanted trespasser on his property just to ensure I was thoroughly humiliated. I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not give them the satisfaction of a fight. I gathered my ruined belongings, climbed into my battered 10-year-old Honda Civic, and drove away into the storm, choosing silent dignity as I left them behind. I parked my 10-year-old Honda Civic in the furthest corner of a 24-hour superstore parking lot. The neon orange glow from the store sign reflected off the rain-streaked windshield, casting harsh shadows across the cramped interior. The heater had stopped working 2 winters ago, so I layered every sweater and jacket I had managed to salvage from the wet lawn over my shivering shoulders. My teeth chattered in the biting silence, but the physical cold was nothing compared to the freezing knot tightening inside my chest. Just hours earlier, I had been standing in a sprawling 6-bedroom mansion with heated floors and custom marble countertops. Now I was curled up in a damp driver's seat, resting my exhausted head against a freezing window pane. I closed my eyes tightly and tried to force my racing heart to slow down. I did not want to cry. I refused to shed a single tear for the people who had just treated me like disposable garbage. But as the heavy rain pounded rhythmically against the roof of the car, the memories pushed their way to the surface, demanding to be felt. I kept picturing the absolute disgust on Jessica's face when she shoved my suitcase out the front door. I kept seeing the smug, superior smirk on Marcus as he sipped his expensive bourbon and watched his wife destroy her only real family. It was completely impossible to reconcile that cruel, arrogant woman with the frightened little girl I had given up my entire youth to raise. When our parents passed away unexpectedly, I was barely 20 years old and Jessica was just 14. I had absolutely no idea how to be a mother, but I knew with unwavering certainty that I could not let her go into the foster system. So I became everything she needed. I dropped out of my early college program without a second thought and took whatever grueling work I could find. For 6 long years, I practically lived on cheap caffeine and 4 hours of sleep. I worked the opening shift as a barista, pouring endless lattes at 5 in the morning. Then I spent my afternoons doing mindless data entry for a local logistics company. At night, I scrubbed floors and cleaned toilets in corporate office buildings, just to make sure Jessica never felt the crushing poverty we were actually living in. I paid for her expensive prom dress. I paid for her braces. I paid every single dime of her out-of-state college tuition so she would graduate completely debt-free and ready to conquer the world. I sacrificed my own social life, my own romantic relationships, and my own financial security because I foolishly believed family was the only thing that truly mattered. I thought my blind devotion would build an unbreakable bond between us. Instead, it only bred toxic entitlement. The exact moment Jessica graduated and married Marcus, everything shifted permanently. Marcus was wealthy, charismatic, and proudly flaunted his newfound tech money. He swept my sister into an intoxicating world of exclusive country clubs, luxury sports cars, and elite social circles, where someone like me was nothing more than an embarrassing secret. Suddenly, the loyal sister who had scrubbed toilets to pay for her textbooks was just a boring, broke accountant who ruined their carefully curated high society aesthetic. They saw my practical clothes and quiet demeanor as a disease they needed to distance themselves from. I woke up the next morning in the parking lot with a stiff neck and a permanently hardened heart. I drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, paid for a week in advance in cash, and began the grueling psychological process of putting my shattered life back together. Exactly 7 days passed in agonizing silence. Day 1 was a thick blur of heavy numbness. I sat on the edge of the stiff motel bed, staring blindly at the dark screen of my phone. A pathetic, conditioned part of my brain actually expected a frantic apology. I thought Jessica might call and blame the alcohol or the stress of her new marriage. I thought Marcus might attempt to smooth things over to maintain his perfect public image. But day 1 bled into day 2, and my phone remained completely silent. By day 4, the heavy numbness finally morphed into sharp, crystal clarity. I went to my office and poured myself entirely into my work, using complex financial spreadsheets to block out the stabbing pain of betrayal. I let the numbers ground me. By day 5, the total silence from my sister was no longer a source of pain. It was a massive, liberating relief. For the first time in over a decade, I did not have to worry about Jessica. I did not have to send her money, cover her careless mistakes, or absorb her stinging insults. By day 7, I had made a firm, unshakable decision. I was done. I would never allow myself to be a disposable stepping stone for anyone ever again. I mentally and emotionally severed the tie. I decided I would change my phone number the following morning and officially close the book on my biological family forever. But fate has a very strange and twisted sense of timing. Exactly 7 days after the brutal eviction at 2 in the morning, the heavy silence of my motel room was violently shattered. My phone vibrated aggressively against the cheap wooden nightstand. The sudden loud buzzing noise made my heart jump straight into my throat. I rolled over and squinted at the bright, glaring screen in the pitch-black room. It was a call from Jessica. For a long, tense moment, I just watched her name flash repeatedly on the screen. My immediate survival instinct was to hit ignore and go back to sleep. I had made my peace. I was completely done with their drama, but the phone kept vibrating furiously, demanding my attention. Against my better judgment, I reached out and accepted the call, pressing the speaker to my ear without saying a single greeting. I did not need to speak because Jessica was already hysterical. "Harper, please, you have to answer me," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a kind of raw animal terror I had never heard from her before. "Please, you have to help me right now. They are tearing the house apart." Through the phone speaker, I could hear the terrifying sounds of heavy boots stomping across hardwood floors and the violent smashing of objects breaking. Men were shouting loud, aggressive commands in the background. "They are tearing everything apart because of what I did with your name." She screamed over the chaos, crying so hard she could barely breathe. "I'm so sorry, Harper. I am so incredibly sorry for what we did with your name." I sat frozen in the driver's seat of my freezing Honda Civic with my phone pressed hard against my ear. Jessica was screaming through the speaker, but the words felt like they were coming from underwater. I asked her to repeat herself. I asked her to tell me what she meant by what she did with my name. I wanted her to make sense of the absolute chaos echoing through the receiver. I could hear men shouting in her background. I could hear heavy footsteps tearing through the expensive hardwood floors of her luxury mansion. The mansion she had banished me from just exactly 7 days ago. My brain struggled to process the sheer panic in her voice. This was the same woman who had looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a broke, depressing burden. Now, she was sobbing like a terrified child begging for my help. Before I could even form a sentence to demand an explanation, my world suddenly exploded in a blinding flash of tactical light. The pitch-black interior of my car was instantly illuminated by piercing high-intensity beams cutting through the heavy, freezing rain. Brilliant strobes of red and blue bounced violently off my streaked windshield. For a split second, I thought an ambulance or a fire truck had pulled into the superstore parking lot to handle an emergency nearby. I squinted against the blinding glare, trying to shield my eyes with my free hand. But the lights were not passing by. They were surrounding me. 3 massive black sport utility vehicles had completely boxed in my tiny battered sedan. They parked at aggressive angles, blocking any possible exit. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. The phone slipped from my trembling fingers and dropped onto the floorboard where Jessica was still crying out my name. I could not answer her. I could not breathe. Through the rain-slicked glass, I saw the heavy doors of the tactical vehicles swing open in unison. Dark figures stepped out into the storm. A sharp, violent knock struck my driver's side window. It was so loud it made my entire body flinch. I turned my head and found myself staring blindly into the center of a military-grade flashlight. Behind the blinding beam, I could just make out the dark silhouette of a man wearing a heavy tactical jacket. The bright yellow letters FBI were printed boldly across his chest. "Open the door right now," the agent shouted, his voice booming with absolute authority over the sound of the torrential rain. "Keep your hands exactly where I can see them, and open the door." My hands shook violently as I fumbled for the door handle. My fingers felt entirely numb from the cold and the sheer adrenaline coursing through my veins. I pushed the door open just a few inches, but before I could step out, a heavy gloved hand grabbed the metal frame and yanked the door all the way open. The freezing rain instantly lashed against my face and soaked my clothes. "Wait, please," I gasped, raising my empty hands into the air. My voice trembled so much I barely recognized it as my own. There has to be some kind of mistake. I am just sleeping in my car tonight. My apartment flooded last week, and I did not have anywhere else to go. My sister kicked me out of her house. I'm not doing anything wrong, I swear. I'm just trying to stay warm. The federal agents did not care about my flooded apartment. They did not care about the tragic backstory of how I ended up sleeping in a superstore parking lot at 2 a.m. They did not care about my sister or the bitter betrayal that led me to this moment. To them, I was not a heartbroken woman trying to survive the night. I was a target. "Step out of the vehicle and turn around," the lead agent commanded, stepping closer. "Do it right now." I stepped out into the biting cold. Puddles of freezing water soaked instantly through my thin canvas sneakers. Before my feet were even firmly planted on the wet asphalt, a firm hand grasped my shoulder and spun me around. I was pressed forcefully against the side of my own car. The cold, wet metal of the Honda sent a shocking shiver down my spine. Someone grabbed my left wrist, pulling it firmly behind my back. Then my right wrist was pulled back to meet it. The harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs locking securely around my wrists echoed loudly in the night air. The cold steel bit into my skin. It was a sensation so profoundly unnatural and terrifying that my knees nearly buckled beneath me. I gasped for air, feeling the rain mix with the hot tears of absolute terror streaming down my cheeks. "Harper Hayes." The agent said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words washed over me like a surreal nightmare. I had heard those exact words 1,000 times in movies and television shows, but hearing them spoken directly to me in the freezing rain felt like the ground had vanished beneath my feet. I opened my mouth to speak, to protest, to beg them to check my identification, because they clearly had the wrong person. But my throat was entirely tight. "You have the right to an attorney." The agent continued reciting the Miranda warning with mechanical precision as he patted down the pockets of my jacket, checking for weapons. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you?" I nodded my head frantically, sending wet strands of hair clinging to my face. "Yes," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Yes, I understand, but please, you have the wrong person. I am an accountant. I go to work and I come home. I do not even have a parking ticket. You have to believe me." Another agent stepped into my field of vision, holding a waterproof clipboard. "We do not have the wrong person," he said flatly. "Harper Hayes, you are being taken into federal custody as the primary suspect in an ongoing investigation regarding a $5 million corporate wire fraud and embezzlement syndicate. $5 million. Wire fraud. Embezzlement syndicate." The heavy loaded words hung in the damp air, striking me with the physical force of a freight train. My brain completely short-circuited. $5 million was an astronomical sum of money. It was a number so massive it felt fictional. I worked 50 hours a week just to afford my modest rent and basic groceries. I had literally skipped meals in my early 20s just to ensure my sister had enough money to buy her college textbooks. I drove a car that rattled when it hit 60 miles an hour on the highway. The idea that anyone could possibly believe I was the criminal mastermind behind a massive multi-million-dollar fraud syndicate was beyond absurd. It was completely insane. But then a horrifying realization hit me. It struck with such brutal clarity that it stole the very breath from my lungs. I remembered the phone call just moments earlier. I remembered Jessica sobbing hysterically over the sound of agents tearing her luxury mansion apart. I remembered her exact frantic words. "They are here because of what I did with your name. What I did with your name." The pieces clicked together in my mind, forming a picture so devastating and utterly terrifying that I actually felt physically sick. Jessica and Marcus had not just kicked me out to remove a depressing presence from their high society life. They had completely stolen my identity. While I was scrubbing toilets and working triple shifts to give Jessica a future, she had taken my pristine, carefully guarded credit and used it as a shield. They had used my spotless record, my professional credentials, and my blind, naive trust to build a shadow empire of stolen money. I was not just discarded. I was intentionally set up to be their perfect disposable fall guy. "Let us go," the lead agent instructed, gripping my upper arm tightly. He pulled me away from the side of my car and guided me toward the largest of the black transport vehicles. I stumbled forward, my wet shoes slipping on the slick pavement. I looked back over my shoulder at my tiny, battered car. The driver's side door was still hanging open. The interior light was still glowing dimly, illuminating the cheap blankets I had huddled under just minutes ago. My phone was still lying on the floorboard, probably still connected to the woman who had effortlessly destroyed my entire existence. "Please," I tried one last time, looking desperately at the agent holding my arm. "You have to check the IP addresses. You have to check the signatures. My sister, she called me right before you arrived. She confessed. She said she used my name. I did not steal any money. I am innocent." The agent did not even blink. "Save it for the detectives down at the precinct," he replied, opening the heavy, reinforced rear door of the transport vehicle. "Watch your head." He placed a hand firmly on top of my head and guided me into the dark, cramped back seat of the Federal Transport SUV. The seats were hard, unyielding plastic designed for prisoners. The windows were heavily tinted and covered with thick metal grates. I slid across the seat, my hands bound tightly behind my back, the cold metal cuffs digging painfully into my skin with every single movement. The agent slammed the heavy door shut, locking me inside the dark isolation of the mobile cage. The sound of that door slamming echoed in my ears with a terrifying finality. I was completely trapped. As the massive vehicle shifted into gear and pulled slowly out of the superstore parking lot, leaving my empty car sitting alone in the rain, the absolute magnitude of my situation crashed down upon me. I was completely alone, facing federal charges that carried decades in prison. My own flesh and blood had systematically orchestrated my destruction to fund a lavish lifestyle. They had lived in a mansion bought with stolen money while forcing me to sleep in a freezing parking lot. The tension in my chest tightened until I felt like I was going to explode. I sat in the pitch-black transport vehicle, trembling from the wet cold and the searing white-hot realization that my life as I knew it was entirely over. I had been completely and utterly blindsided. The interrogation room was a sterile white concrete box, explicitly designed to break human spirits and strip away any lingering sense of hope. The industrial air conditioning blasted from a rusted ceiling vent directly above the bolted metal table, turning my soaking wet clothes into a heavy layer of pure ice against my skin. I sat on a rigid metal chair, shivering so violently, my teeth clicked together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm that echoed in the completely silent room. The heavy steel handcuffs had finally been removed, but my raw wrists still bore deep red indentations from the unforgiving metal. The sheer visceral terror of the sudden arrest in the parking lot was slowly beginning to wear off, leaving behind a thick, suffocating fog of absolute confusion. I kept staring blindly at the blank gray wall, desperately trying to understand how a petty noise complaint had miraculously escalated into a full federal transport vehicle. I honestly thought there had been a monumental mistake. I thought maybe Marcus had filed some kind of extreme restraining order just to be vindictive and cruel. I had absolutely no criminal record. I paid my taxes early every single year. I lived an incredibly boring, predictable life, revolving entirely around spreadsheets and balance ledgers. The heavy steel door clicked loudly and swung open, breaking the suffocating silence. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a badly rumpled gray suit walked into the room, carrying 2 styrofoam cups of cheap black coffee and a thick manila folder that looked as heavy as a phone book. He set one of the steaming cups directly in front of me and sat down heavily in the metal chair across the table. He introduced himself plainly as Detective Reynolds from the Financial Crimes Division. He did not look angry or aggressive. He just looked incredibly tired. He looked at me with the kind of clinical, distant pity a veterinarian gives a stray dog that has just been catastrophically hit by a speeding car. I wrapped my freezing, trembling hands around the hot styrofoam cup, desperate to absorb any microscopic trace of warmth into my frozen bones. I tried to speak, but my vocal cords felt like dry sandpaper. I croaked out a desperate, rambling plea, explaining that there was a massive, terrible misunderstanding. I told him I was just a regular corporate accountant whose apartment had unfortunately flooded. I told him my younger sister had kicked me out into a freezing thunderstorm just because I complained about cooking a lavish dinner for her friends. I begged him to call my firm and verify my employment and my spotless background. Detective Reynolds did not interrupt my frantic rambling. He let me talk until my voice completely gave out and faded into a pathetic whisper. Then he sighed, deeply lifted the massive folder, and dropped it squarely onto the center of the metal table. The thick stack of paper hit the solid surface with a loud, dull thud that echoed ominously off the concrete walls. He opened the heavy cover and began sliding official documents across the table toward me one by one. He did not ask me where I was hiding the money or demand a confession. He simply tapped his finger on the bottom of the first page and asked me to identify my signature. I leaned forward, squinting at the pages under the harsh buzzing fluorescent light. The first document was a massive commercial loan application from a major national bank. The requested funding amount was $1.2 million. The applicant listed was a limited liability corporation I had never heard of in my entire life, but the primary guarantor listed at the very bottom of the signature page was me, Harper Hayes. Next to my printed name was my exact signature. It was not a sloppy, rushed forgery. It was a perfect, flawless replica of the way I crossed my letters and looped my cursive. It looked exactly like the signature printed on my state driver license. My stomach dropped violently into a bottomless black hole. I shook my head frantically, pushing the paper back toward him across the metal table. I told him I never signed that document. I told him I did not even have the collateral to secure a mortgage on a small townhouse, let alone a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate loan. Detective Reynolds just watched my panicked face in silence and slid another document forward. Then he slid another one, then another. Within minutes, the entire metal table was completely covered in a chaotic mosaic of complex financial paperwork. There were offshore wire authorizations explicitly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into untraceable holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. There were incredibly complex shell company guarantees permanently tying my personal identity to massive corporate debts. There were immense lines of business credit opened directly under my social security number. Every single page painted a highly detailed, terrifying picture of a sophisticated, wealthy criminal mastermind who had been moving illicit funds across the globe. "Look closely at the dates," Harper the detective said, his voice dropping to a low, serious rumble that commanded my absolute attention. "Look at the credit history reports attached to the files." I forced my wide, trembling eyes to focus on the tiny fine print buried in the documents. The earliest document was dated exactly 2 years ago. 2 years. My mind instantly raced backward, connecting the dots to that exact timeline. 2 years ago was the precise moment Jessica had married Marcus. It was the exact same time Marcus had miraculously launched his flashy new tech startup in downtown Chicago with seemingly unlimited capital. I had always been completely meticulous about my personal finances. I lived incredibly frugally, paid off my student loans years early, and maintained a pristine credit score well over 800 points. I treated my financial stability like a sacred, unbreakable shield, because growing up with absolutely nothing taught me to protect my security at all costs. I stared blankly at the credit reports attached to the fraudulent loan files. My perfect 800 credit score had been weaponized. It had been used as the foundational pillar to build a towering, invisible house of cards. They needed a squeaky clean financial profile with zero existing debt and a flawless repayment history to secure the massive initial seed capital for their shadow companies. Marcus had the flashy business plan and the charming charisma, but he absolutely did not have the pristine credit history to back it up. I did. The freezing temperature in the interrogation room completely vanished, replaced by a searing, suffocating heat violently rising in my chest. My breath came in short, jagged gasps as the horrifying reality finally clicked into place. Jessica had full access to my social security number. She knew my maiden name. She knew every single password recovery question because we grew up in the exact same miserable house. When I was busy working 60-hour weeks at the accounting firm, just trying to keep my head above water, my own flesh and blood was systematically tearing my identity apart to fund her wealthy husband's failing tech empire. Detective Reynolds leaned back in his squeaky metal chair and folded his hands, resting them over his stomach. Marcus has been running a massive corporate Ponzi scheme, the detective explained bluntly, without an ounce of sympathy. His startup never generated a single legitimate dollar of actual profit. He used new investor money to pay off old debts and funneled the rest directly into personal offshore accounts to fund his luxury sports cars and that 6-bedroom mansion in the suburbs. But Marcus is a highly calculated guy. He never put his own name on the most toxic financial liabilities. He needed a blind shadow partner. He needed a perfect fall guy. He needed someone with a spotless financial record who lived a quiet, lonely life and rarely checked their deep credit history. I closed my eyes as a massive wave of pure, blinding nausea washed over me, making the room spin. The physical pain of being thrown out of their house into the freezing rain was absolutely nothing compared to the profound psychological violence of this ultimate betrayal. They did not just kick me out because I was a depressing nuisance to their social standing. They kicked me out because the walls were finally closing in on their massive fraud, and they urgently needed to create a clear physical separation before the federal agents inevitably arrived. They needed to strategically frame me as the rogue criminal sister who had betrayed their trust and fled the scene of the crime. The forced waiting in my flooded apartment, the sudden, unprovoked argument over an overcooked dinner, Jessica aggressively dragging my suitcase out the front door in front of the neighbors, Marcus calling the local patrol car to officially report a trespasser on his estate. It was all a carefully orchestrated theatrical performance. They desperately needed an official documented police record showing that they had forcibly evicted me from their property to solidly build their false narrative. They needed to look like innocent, heartbroken victims who had just devastatingly discovered their trusted older sister was actually an embezzling monster. I looked back down at the cold metal table, completely covered in my forged signatures. For over a decade, I had completely abandoned my own dreams to ensure Jessica had absolutely everything she ever wanted. I had fiercely shielded her from the harsh, punishing realities of the world, and in direct return, she had eagerly handed my entire life over to a charismatic con artist, allowing him to systematically butcher my identity, just for a fleeting taste of high society wealth. The detective leaned forward, resting his heavy elbows on the table, and looking me dead in the eye. "You are currently facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Harper," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You are the sole legal guarantor on $5 million of stolen money. I need you to start talking right now, or I am going to have to walk straight out of that door and let the federal prosecutors completely destroy the rest of your life." I sat perfectly frozen in the sterile concrete room, staring at the undeniable physical proof of my sister's absolute malice. The little girl I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise had effectively signed my death warrant just to afford a lifestyle she never actually earned. She had thrown me to the wolves with a perfectly clear conscience. I took a slow, deep, trembling breath, deliberately filling my lungs with the cold, stale air of the holding room. I did not cry. The tears had completely dried up, leaving behind a barren wasteland of pure cold logic. They thought I was just a naive, boring accountant who would immediately crumble under the terrifying weight of a federal interrogation. They thought I would blindly panic and take the fall for their crimes. They were completely wrong. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room clicked open and Detective Reynolds motioned for me to stand. He did not say a word as he grabbed my upper arm with a firm, unyielding grip, guiding me out of the freezing concrete box and into the chaotic, brightly lit corridor of the federal precinct. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a harsh mechanical hum that made my throbbing headache even worse. My canvas sneakers squeaked pathetically against the polished linoleum floor, leaving tiny trails of rainwater with every single step I took. I felt entirely, completely hollowed out. My wrists throbbed from where the steel cuffs had dug into my skin, and my clothes were still damp, clinging uncomfortably to my freezing body. I walked with my head down, trying to process the absolute magnitude of the betrayal I had just uncovered. I was a dead woman, walking caught in a meticulously crafted financial snare designed by the very person I had sacrificed my entire youth to protect. As Detective Reynolds escorted me past a row of glass-walled interview rooms, the loud murmur of a familiar voice cut through the background noise of ringing phones and clacking keyboards. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart seized violently in my chest. Sitting in the center of a brightly lit open squad room surrounded by 3 senior investigators and a sympathetic female officer were Jessica and Marcus. The sheer visual contrast between us was instantly sickening. I looked like a desperate, homeless vagrant who had just been dragged out of a storm drain. I was shivering in wrinkled, damp clothes, my hair tangled and matted to my face, my eyes swollen from exhaustion and shock. Marcus and Jessica looked like they had just stepped out of a high-end lifestyle magazine, completely untouched by the absolute nightmare they had orchestrated. Marcus sat tall and composed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. As an incredibly successful-looking African-American tech founder, he knew exactly how to command a room. He projected an aura of absolute authority mixed with deep, dignified sorrow. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, speaking to the senior detectives in a low, calm, measured voice that practically demanded respect. He did not look like a man who had just stolen $5 million and framed his sister-in-law. He looked like a brilliant, hardworking CEO who had just been tragically betrayed by someone he trusted. Jessica sat right beside him, playing her role with sickening perfection. She wore a cashmere sweater and designer trousers, slightly rumpled just enough to suggest she had been abruptly woken up by this terrible crisis, but still impeccably wealthy. She was clutching a crumpled tissue in her manicured hands, sobbing quietly into Marcus's shoulder. He wrapped a protective arm around her, holding her close, murmuring soft, reassuring words into her hair while the detectives watched them with expressions of profound empathy. I stood frozen in the hallway, completely paralyzed as I listened to the venomous lies pouring smoothly from Marcus's mouth. We gave her absolutely everything Marcus told the lead investigator, shaking his head with a perfectly crafted look of bitter disappointment. When her apartment flooded, I did not even hesitate. I told Jessica to bring her into our home. I set her up in our best guest suite. I wanted to help her get back on her feet. I knew she struggled financially, and I knew she harbored a lot of deep resentment toward my wife because of our success, but I honestly thought family was family. I thought we could trust her. The detective nodded, taking diligent notes on his legal pad. "And she had full access to your corporate accounts, Mr. Hayes?" the detective asked. Marcus sighed deeply, running a hand over his face like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Yes." He lied smoothly without a single tremor of hesitation in his voice. "Harper is an accountant. She has always been incredibly sharp with numbers, but she never really made anything of herself. She bounced around doing low-level bookkeeping. When my tech startup began scaling and securing massive venture capital funding, I wanted to give her a real chance. I offered her a position managing our internal ledgers. I gave her administrative access to our secure servers and our banking portals. I trusted her to handle our seed capital because Jessica swore her sister was loyal. I never in a million years imagined she would use my own company infrastructure to open ghost accounts and siphon millions of dollars into offshore trusts using forged authorizations. "It is entirely my fault," Jessica wailed suddenly, burying her face in her hands. Her performance was absolutely flawless. Her shoulders shook with manufactured grief, and she let out a choked, devastated sob that echoed loudly across the squad room. I brought her into our home. I gave her the security codes. I just felt so incredibly sorry for her. She was always so miserable, so bitter about how my life turned out. She spent years throwing it in my face that she had to work tough jobs when we were younger. I thought giving her this responsibility would finally make her feel important. I did not know she was spending her nights in our guest room, slowly stealing my husband's company out from under him. She wanted to destroy us out of pure spite. She wanted to see me lose everything just so she could feel superior. A female officer immediately stepped forward, placing a gentle, comforting hand on Jessica's back and offering her a fresh cup of water. "It is not your fault, ma'am," the officer said softly, her voice dripping with genuine compassion. "You tried to help a family member. You could not have known she was capable of this kind of sophisticated corporate sabotage. These rogue accountants know exactly how to manipulate the system. They use your trust as a weapon. You and your husband are the victims here. Do not blame yourselves for her criminal greed." I felt violently, physically ill. The sheer audacity of their lies hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. They were not just framing me for the missing $5 million. They were entirely rewriting the entire history of our lives. They were erasing a decade of my grueling labor, my complete financial sacrifice, my lost 20s, and twisting it all into a narrative where I was nothing but a jealous, toxic parasite feeding off their hard-earned success. Marcus was explicitly painting me as a rogue, low-level bookkeeper who abused his charitable nepotism to enact a petty revenge plot. Jessica was portraying herself as the generous, heartbroken sister who only ever tried to lift me out of my own pathetic misery. I looked around the squad room and the most terrifying realization slowly washed over me. Every single person in that room completely believed them. The detectives were looking at Marcus with deep professional respect. They were looking at Jessica with profound, protective sympathy. And then the lead investigator glanced up from his notepad and looked straight through the glass wall directly at me standing in the hallway. The absolute disgust in his eyes was unmistakable. He looked at me as if I were a piece of toxic garbage rotting on the bottom of his shoe. He saw exactly what Marcus and Jessica had painted for him. He saw a bitter, jealous, unstable woman who had finally snapped and tried to destroy the wealthy, beautiful sister she secretly despised. I looked down at my own trembling hands. I looked at my soaking wet canvas sneakers and my cheap, wrinkled sweater. I felt the tangled mess of my damp hair clinging to my pale, exhausted face. In that horrifying moment, I finally understood the pure evil genius of their entire setup. The optics were absolutely perfect. They had orchestrated my physical eviction into the storm specifically to complete this visual narrative. They knew that when the federal agents inevitably dragged me in from the cold, wet parking lot, I would look exactly like the unhinged, desperate criminal they were describing. I did not look like an innocent victim. I did not look like a woman who had spent the last 10 years sacrificing her own dreams to keep her sister safe. I looked like a cornered rat. I looked guilty. Marcus had clearly planned this for months. He knew that in the eyes of the law and the eyes of society, a wealthy, charismatic tech CEO and his beautiful, crying wife would always be given the immediate benefit of the doubt over a disheveled, homeless-looking woman with zero social capital. They had successfully weaponized my own poverty against me. They had used the very sacrifices I made for them to prove that I was financially desperate enough to steal $5 million. Every single action they took was a calculated, deliberate step toward locking me in a federal prison cell so they could walk away with the stolen venture capital money free and clear. Detective Reynolds tugged hard on my arm, pulling me away from the glass wall and forcing me to keep walking down the long, sterile corridor. "Keep moving, Hayes." He muttered, his voice tight with the same disgust I had seen in the other officer's eyes. "You can stare at your family in the courtroom." I did not fight his grip. I let him pull me forward, my wet shoes squeaking softly on the floor. The panic that had completely consumed me in the parking lot was entirely gone now. The tears were gone. The confusion was gone. The heartbroken older sister who just wanted to be loved and appreciated by her only remaining family member died right there in that precinct hallway. She was completely, utterly eradicated. In her place, a cold, lethal stillness settled deeply into my bones. Marcus and Jessica were absolutely certain they had won. They were currently sitting in that squad room, drinking free coffee, soaking up the sympathy of the federal police, and congratulating themselves on executing the perfect, flawless corporate crime. They honestly believed I was a helpless, ignorant pawn who would silently crumble under the terrifying weight of a massive federal indictment. They thought my complete lack of wealth and status made me an easy, disposable target. But they had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They actually believed their own lie. They believed I was just a lowly, struggling bookkeeper who barely understood basic ledgers. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. They had no idea what I actually did for a living, or the immense, terrifying power I quietly wielded behind the scenes of the exact financial institution they had just actively defrauded. As Detective Reynolds pushed me toward the holding cells to wait for my official booking process, I stopped trembling. I squared my shoulders and took a deep, steady breath. The performance in the squad room was incredibly convincing, but the real show had not even started yet. Detective Reynolds told me not to move. He pointed to a cheap plastic water cooler tucked into a narrow, fluorescent-lit alcove just outside the main booking area. He said he needed to retrieve a specific set of intake forms from the records room down the hall. He told me to get a drink of water and wait right there. The moment his heavy footsteps faded around the corner, the oppressive, bustling noise of the police precinct seemed to suddenly drop into a strange, muffled silence. I stood there shivering in my soaked clothes, clutching a tiny paper cup of lukewarm water. My wrists were still aching from the cold steel of the handcuffs. I felt like the world was spinning out of control. I was entirely alone, completely terrified, and facing decades in a federal prison for a crime I did not commit. Then I heard the distinct, confident sound of expensive leather shoes stepping onto the scuffed linoleum floor. I looked up and my breath caught in my throat. Marcus was walking toward me. He had slipped out of the squad room while the other officers were distracted by Jessica and her endless manufactured tears. He moved with the effortless, gliding grace of a man who owned every room he walked into. His tailored charcoal gray suit did not have a single wrinkle. His posture was completely relaxed. He was an incredibly successful-looking African-American tech founder, and he knew exactly how to use his commanding physical presence to intimidate anyone who stood in his way. As he stepped into the narrow alcove with me, he glanced back over his shoulder to make absolutely certain the hallway was completely clear of any police officers. When he turned back to face me, the grieving betrayed brother-in-law routine completely vanished. The warm, sympathetic mask melted away, revealing the cold, calculating predator lurking underneath. He stepped dangerously close, violating my personal space. The overwhelming scent of his expensive designer cologne mixed with the stale metallic smell of the precinct, making my stomach turn. He leaned down slightly, so his face was only inches from mine. When he spoke, his voice was not the booming, confident tone he used in the squad room. It was a vicious, quiet hiss designed to cut straight to the bone. "You look absolutely pathetic, Harper," he whispered, his dark eyes scanning my wet clothes and trembling hands with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You actually look like a criminal right now. The cops took one look at you, and they knew exactly what you are. A jealous, bitter failure who could not stand watching her younger sister live the life you always wanted." I pressed my back hard against the concrete wall, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. I tried to speak, but my throat was paralyzed with fear. "Listen to me very carefully." Marcus continued, his voice smooth and lethally calm. "You are going to plead guilty. You are going to accept the public defender they assigned to you, and you are going to take the plea deal. Do not try to fight this. A broke clerk like you does not stand a chance against my lawyers. I have a legal team on retainer that bills out at $2,000 an hour. If you try to drag Jessica and me into this, I will personally make sure the prosecutors bury you so deep under federal charges, you will never see the outside of a prison cell again." He smiled, a chilling, terrifying expression that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Take the fall, Harper," he said softly. "Accept the blame like a good older sister. If you go quietly and keep your mouth completely shut, I will make sure you are comfortable. I will put a few $100s in your prison commissary account every month. You can buy yourself some decent soap and extra snacks. It is honestly more than you deserve after forcing us to deal with your depressing energy all these years." I stared at him, completely speechless. The sheer absolute arrogance of this man was suffocating. He had just stolen my entire identity, framed me for a massive multi-million-dollar federal crime, and ruined my entire future. And now he was offering me spare change for prison snacks, like it was some kind of generous charitable donation. But Marcus was a narcissist, and narcissists can never just walk away when they think they have achieved the perfect victory. They always need an audience to fully appreciate their brilliant genius. He could not resist twisting the knife just one last time. "You have absolutely no idea how big this is," he whispered, leaning in even closer, a dark, greedy excitement flashing in his eyes. "You think this is just some petty bank fraud? You are taking the fall for a masterpiece, Harper. We completely drained one of the most ruthless elite venture capital firms in the entire country. We built a shadow network they did not even notice until the accounts were totally empty. $5 million pulled right out from under the noses of the smartest financial executives in Chicago." He let out a low, highly satisfied laugh. "We bled Apex Sterling Holdings entirely dry." He boasted, his voice vibrating with pure, smug triumph. "And the best part is those arrogant suits at Apex Sterling are going to send you to federal prison for doing it." Marcus gave me one final condescending look, entirely satisfied with his psychological destruction. He straightened his expensive silk tie, turned his back on me, and walked confidently away down the hall, heading back to comfort his crying wife. He walked away laughing. I stood completely frozen against the concrete wall, but something incredible was happening inside my chest. The suffocating, terrifying panic that had been drowning me for the past 2 hours suddenly completely evaporated. The frantic racing of my heart instantly slowed to a steady, methodical rhythm. The trembling in my frozen hands completely stopped. Apex Sterling Holdings. the name echoed in my mind, ringing like a crystal clear bell. For years, my family had relentlessly mocked my boring, modest career. They called me a low-level number cruncher, a simple bookkeeper, a broke clerk. I never bothered to correct them because correcting them would have required explaining my strict corporate non-disclosure agreements. Correcting them would have meant endless demands from Jessica for luxury loans and investment tips. I let them believe I was a nobody because it kept my quiet life peaceful. Marcus and Jessica thought they had chosen the perfect oblivious fall guy. They thought I was a naive financial peasant who would simply crumble under the weight of a federal indictment. But Marcus had made a catastrophic fatal error. I did not work as a basic data entry clerk. I was a senior forensic auditor for Apex Sterling Holdings. My entire specific, highly specialized career was dedicated to actively hunting down sophisticated corporate embezzlers, dismantling fraudulent syndicates, and utterly destroying financial criminals for the exact firm he had just robbed. My desk was literally located on the top floor of the Apex Sterling skyscraper. The multi-million-dollar phantom leak Marcus was currently bragging about was the exact same corporate fraud file sitting on my office desk right now. A slow, cold, lethal calm washed over my entire body. I dropped the tiny paper cup of water into the trash can. I was no longer the terrified older sister trying to survive a nightmare. I was an apex predator, staring directly at a perfectly trapped prey. Marcus thought he had orchestrated a brilliant foolproof crime. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed the entire confession, the motive, and the complete digital blueprint of his stolen empire directly to the one woman in Chicago who had the precise legal authority and corporate power to completely annihilate his entire existence. I took a deep breath of the stale precinct air. The victim act was officially over. It was time to go to work. I posted my bail just as the bleak gray dawn began to break over the Chicago skyline. The process was agonizingly slow, mechanical, and completely devoid of humanity. I handed over a cashier check drawn from an emergency fund I had kept hidden for years, carefully signing the release forms with hands that had finally stopped shaking. When I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the precinct and stepped out into the freezing morning air, the relentless rain had finally stopped. The city smelled like wet asphalt and exhaust fumes, but to me, it smelled like absolute clarity. I did not walk back to the 24-hour Superstore parking lot to retrieve my battered 10-year-old car. That pathetic vehicle belonged to the broken, submissive sister who allowed herself to be victimized and abused. That woman died in the holding cell. I flagged down a passing taxi and gave the driver a single address located in the ultra-wealthy financial district of downtown Chicago. I sat in the back of the cab, watching the city wake up, my mind operating with the cold, ruthless precision of a supercomputer. For 6 agonizing months, my specialized forensic audit team had been tracking a highly sophisticated phantom leak within our venture capital portfolios. $5 million had essentially vanished into thin air, masked by layers of brilliant corporate obfuscation and encrypted shell companies. We knew the money was gone, but the architect of the fraud had built a digital fortress so pristine that even our best analysts were hitting solid brick walls. I had spent countless sleepless nights staring at dual ledgers trying to find a single crack in the armor. Now I finally understood why the perpetrator was so successful. Marcus had explicitly used my own spotless financial identity and my intimate knowledge of corporate banking structures against me. He had reverse engineered my very own career, utilizing my flawless 800 credit score to bypass every single security trigger I had personally designed for the firm. The taxi pulled up to the curb outside the towering glass and steel monolith of Apex Sterling Holdings. The building scraped the sky, a massive monument to immense wealth and absolute corporate power. I walked through the revolving doors, and the pristine silence of the grand marble lobby enveloped me. The elite security guards, who usually greeted me with polite nods, blinked in total shock at my appearance. I was still wearing my damp, wrinkled clothes, my canvas sneakers squishing softly against the polished Italian marble floor. I did not offer them a single explanation. I simply swiped my highest tier executive clearance badge and stepped into the private express elevator, hitting the button for the top floor. When the heavy steel doors opened onto the executive suite, I bypassed my quiet corner office and walked straight toward the private employee locker room. The plush carpeting absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I opened my secure locker and stripped off the damp, pathetic jacket that smelled like stale precinct air and cheap motel soap. I reached in and pulled out a sharply tailored navy blue designer blazer. I slipped it over my shoulders and smoothed the lapels. The transformation was instantaneous and profound. The physical weight of the structured blazer grounded me completely. I pulled my tangled hair back into a severe, tight bun, washing my face with cold water at the vanity sink. When I looked up at the large vanity mirror, the terrified, exhausted sister was entirely gone. Staring back at me was the senior forensic auditor of Apex Sterling Holdings, a woman who routinely dismantled corrupt empires before she even finished her morning coffee. I walked out of the locker room and marched directly down the quiet hallway toward the massive corner office belonging to our chief executive officer, William Sterling. I did not knock. I simply pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped inside. William was standing by his massive floor-to-ceiling window, holding a porcelain cup of black coffee, reviewing the morning market reports on his tablet. He was a ruthless, demanding man who managed billions of dollars in aggressive venture capital, and he absolutely despised interruptions. He turned around sharply, an annoyed reprimand already forming on his lips, but the words completely died in his throat when he saw me. He took in the stark contrast of my damp, wrinkled trousers, clashing with my immaculate corporate blazer, and the deeply unsettling, lethal calm radiating from my eyes. "Harper," he said, lowering his tablet slowly, "what on earth has happened to you? You look like you just survived a war zone." I walked across the expansive Persian rug, closing the distance between us. I did not say a word until I reached his massive mahogany desk. I pulled the heavily redacted police report out of my portfolio, the exact same thick file Detective Reynolds had dropped in front of me just hours ago, and I slammed it down squarely onto the center of his immaculate desk. The sharp thud echoed through the silent corner office. "I found our missing $5 million. I said, my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly even. "I know exactly how the phantom leak was orchestrated. I know exactly where the money went, and I know the exact identity of the man who stole it." William set his coffee cup down immediately, all traces of annoyance vanishing, replaced by sharp, predatory corporate instinct. He leaned over the mahogany desk, pulling the thick police file toward him. He quickly flipped through the first few pages, his seasoned eyes scanning the complex loan applications, the offshore wire transfers, and the massive corporate guarantees. He paused, his finger hovering over the signature line on the third page. "This is your signature, Harper," he said, his voice dropping to a low, confused growl. "Why am I looking at federal police documents bearing your signature, authorizing the release of our venture capital funds? Because the man who orchestrated this entire fraudulent syndicate is my brother-in-law," I replied, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. "His name is Marcus. He is the charismatic tech CEO who has been pitching our firm for the past 2 years. He and my younger sister, Jessica, systematically stole my identity, weaponized my pristine credit score, and forged my signature to bypass our internal security triggers. They legally framed me as their rogue accountant to take the absolute fall for the entire $5 million embezzlement. I spent last night sleeping in my freezing car because they forcefully evicted me from their mansion to solidify their victim narrative. I spent this morning sitting in a federal interrogation room wearing steel handcuffs. William Sterling stood perfectly still, absorbing the immense gravity of the situation. The color slowly drained from his face before rushing back in a dark, terrifying tide of pure corporate fury. Apex Sterling Holdings was not a company that tolerated theft. They were financial sharks who destroyed anyone foolish enough to cross them. The fact that a local tech startup founder had successfully infiltrated their secure systems by cannibalizing the identity of their own senior auditor was an insult that demanded immediate, absolute destruction. William reached for the sleek black telephone sitting on the corner of his desk. His knuckles were white. "I am calling our elite legal division right now." William commanded, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "I am assembling the entire team. We are going to deploy every single corporate attorney we have and absolutely crush this man. We will freeze his company assets by noon. We will file a massive civil suit by 3, and we will hand him directly to the federal prosecutors by dinner. He is going to regret the day he ever learned how to spell the word venture capital. He picked up the receiver, but before he could press a single button, I reached across the mahogany desk and placed my hand firmly over his. I pressed the phone back down into the receiver, cutting off the dial tone. "No," I said, my voice colder and harder than ice. "Do not call the lawyers. Do not trigger the legal division. Do not make a single move against him yet." William stared at me in absolute disbelief. "Harper, he just stole $5 million of our capital and tried to send you to a federal penitentiary for his crimes. We have to strike him immediately before he realizes you are out on bail. We need to shut him down today." "If you strike him today, he wins," I explained, leaning forward, planting both of my hands firmly on his desk. "Marcus is incredibly arrogant, but he is not stupid. He knows the federal agents are currently investigating the fake trail he explicitly left for them. If Apex Sterling suddenly unleashes a massive corporate lawsuit this afternoon, Marcus will immediately file for absolute bankruptcy. He will claim complete corporate insolvency and hide behind complex legal protections. He will take the $5 million he already siphoned into those encrypted offshore accounts, and he will completely vanish. We will spend 5 grueling years fighting his discount defense attorneys in civil court, and we will never see a single dime of that stolen money ever again." William slowly pulled his hand away from the telephone, his eyes narrowing as he processed my strategic logic. He knew I was right. In the world of high-stakes financial fraud, striking too early was the ultimate fatal mistake. "What are you asking for, Harper?" he asked quietly, giving me the floor. "I need exactly 72 hours, I said, holding his gaze with unwavering absolute conviction. "Do not file any lawsuits. Do not send any cease and desist letters. I want them to firmly believe that their perfectly orchestrated plan is working flawlessly. I want Marcus and Jessica to think I am utterly destroyed and terrified of prison. If they think they have won, they will get sloppy. They will drop their guard. They will attempt to pull the remaining hidden funds into their primary operational accounts to secure their new investments." I stepped back from the mahogany desk, straightening the sharp lapels of my navy blue blazer. "Give me 72 hours of absolute radio silence," I demanded. "I will personally trace every single encrypted offshore account. I will map out his entire shadow network of shell companies. I will lock down the digital footprint of every forged document, and I will quietly freeze the international transfer nodes so he cannot move a single penny. I will build an airtight, inescapable financial cage around them. I want to ensure that when we finally spring the trap, Marcus and Jessica cannot hide a single dime in bankruptcy court. I want total, unmitigated annihilation." William Sterling looked at me for a long, heavy moment. He looked at the damp, wrinkled trousers I was still wearing and the fierce, unbroken fire blazing in my eyes. A slow, deeply satisfied smile crept onto his face. He recognized the exact same ruthless determination that had made me his best forensic auditor. He knew I was not just looking to clear my name. I was looking to absolutely dismantle the people who had tried to destroy me. "You have your 72 hours, Harper," he said softly, pushing the police report back across the desk toward me. "Build the cage, and when you are ready to drop the guillotine on your brother-in-law, you let me know. We will bring the entire company down on his head." I picked up the file and tucked it smoothly under my arm. The terrified, exhausted sister, who had wept in the freezing rain, was completely dead and gone. I turned on my heel and walked out of the massive corner office, my mind already calculating the precise, devastating algorithms I would use to tear my sister's perfectly stolen life completely to the ground. 72 hours was exactly how much time I had to completely dismantle the perfectly constructed lives of the 2 people who had gleefully destroyed mine. The first 24 hours were spent buried in the highly secure digital archives of Apex Sterling Holdings, setting up the invisible traps and building the financial cage I had promised my chief executive officer. But tracking the complex offshore accounts from the outside was only half the battle. Marcus had utilized a heavy military-grade encryption on his personal hardware. I needed direct physical access to his primary machine, while the master drive was fully decrypted and completely unlocked. I needed him to open the door for me himself. And the only way to get a raging narcissist to open a door is to knock loudly on his massive, fragile ego. I sent Jessica a single desperate text message from an untraceable prepaid burner phone. I told her I was absolutely terrified. I told her the federal agents were aggressively threatening me with 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary, and I was completely breaking down. I begged her to meet me in person just one last time before I did something drastic. I knew she would immediately show Marcus the message. I knew they would not be able to resist the intoxicating thrill of seeing me completely defeated and practically begging for their mercy. I chose a loud, crowded, independently owned coffee shop right on the edge of the bustling financial district. It was exactly the kind of chaotic environment where absolute privacy was impossible, but blending into the loud background noise was incredibly easy. The physical preparation was absolutely crucial. I could not walk into that cafe looking like the senior forensic auditor of Apex Sterling Holdings. I had to look exactly like the pathetic, broken victim they fully expected to see. I dug my ruined, rain-soaked canvas sneakers out of a plastic bag. I put on the exact same baggy, faded gray sweater I had been wearing when Jessica violently shoved me out into the freezing storm. I intentionally did not brush my hair, letting it hang in tangled, unkempt strands around my face. I rubbed away any trace of makeup, deliberately enhancing the dark, exhausted purple circles under my eyes. When I looked in the mirror, I looked like a desperate hunted animal clinging to the very edge of sanity. It was absolutely perfect. I sat in a small cramped booth near the back of the bustling cafe, clutching a steaming mug of black coffee with both hands. The bell above the glass door chimed sharply, and Marcus and Jessica walked inside. They immediately stood out from the crowd of college students and tired office workers. Marcus was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than the entire espresso machine sitting behind the counter. Jessica was draped in an immaculate beige cashmere coat, holding a designer handbag tightly against her side. They scanned the crowded room with perfectly synchronized expressions of deep superiority and performative pity until their eyes finally locked onto me, huddled miserably in the back booth. As they walked towards my table, I forced my hands to tremble violently. I slouched my shoulders downward, shrinking myself into the worn vinyl seat, making myself appear as small and insignificant as humanly possible. Marcus slid into the booth across from me, his dark eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. Jessica sat right next to him, refusing to make direct eye contact, staring uncomfortably at the scuffed wooden table. "You look absolutely terrible." Harper Marcus said, his voice a low, smooth hum of pure condescension. He did not bother to order a coffee or acknowledge anyone else in the room. He just leaned forward, resting his expensive gold watch against the sticky table. "We told the federal agents you were completely unstable. It looks like we were absolutely right." "Why did you ask us to come here?" Harper Jessica whispered, her voice dripping with incredibly fake sympathy. "You know you are not supposed to be contacting us. The detectives explicitly told us you are a severe flight risk." "That is exactly why I needed to see you," I said, forcing my voice to crack and waver with perfectly manufactured panic. I leaned forward frantically, glancing around the crowded cafe like I was terrified the federal agents were actively hiding behind the pastry display. "I cannot go to prison, Jessica. I absolutely cannot survive in there. You know me. You know I am terrified of everything. I will not make it a single week in a federal penitentiary. I need to run. I have to get out of the country right now before the grand jury hands down the official federal indictment." Marcus let out a short, highly amused laugh. "You want to run?" he asked, raising an arrogant eyebrow. "How exactly do you plan to do that, Harper? You are completely broke. The feds froze your pathetic checking account yesterday morning. You do not even have enough cash to buy a bus ticket to the state border, let alone successfully flee the country." "I know," I whispered, letting a fake, desperate tear spill over my lower lash line and track slowly down my cheek. "I know I have absolutely nothing left. That is why I am begging you, Marcus. I need escape money. just $10,000 to get safely across the Canadian border and disappear forever. If you just give me $10,000, you will never, ever see my face again." Jessica scoffed, rolling her eyes incredibly dramatically. "Are you actually out of your mind, Harper? Why on earth would we ever give you $10,000 after you maliciously abused our trust and tried to ruin my husband's company?" I reached into the deep pocket of my baggy sweater and pulled out a folded piece of crisp white paper. I slid it across the sticky wooden table toward Marcus. My hand was visibly shaking, but my heart was beating with a slow, lethal rhythm. "Because if you give me the money, I will give you this," I said, my voice dropping to a desperate, terrified whisper. Marcus picked up the folded paper and opened it. I watched his eyes scan the handwritten ink. It was a perfectly crafted, highly detailed confession. I had written it exactly the way a desperate, unhinged, and guilty accountant would write it. I explicitly confessed to using my administrative access to illegally forge the loan documents. I confessed to bypassing the corporate security protocols out of pure spite and deep-seated jealousy. I confessed to orchestrating the entire $5 million embezzlement completely on my own without Marcus or Jessica having any knowledge of the crime whatsoever. I even signed it at the very bottom, perfectly matching the forged signature they had illegally used on the massive commercial loans. Marcus read every single word in absolute total silence. I could literally see the greedy, intoxicating thrill flooding directly through his veins. This piece of paper was the ultimate, absolute victory. With a signed, handwritten confession detailing my sole guilt, the federal prosecutors would immediately close their extensive investigation into his tech startup. He would be completely cleared of all suspicion, and the $5 million resting securely in his encrypted offshore accounts would be his to keep forever. His massive, insatiable ego simply could not resist the absolute perfection of the deal. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it securely into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit. $10,000 is a very small price to pay to finally rid ourselves of your depressing, toxic presence. Harper Marcus said, a cruel, deeply satisfied smile stretching across his handsome face. He reached into his leather messenger bag and pulled out his sleek, silver laptop. "You are incredibly lucky. I am feeling generous today. Give me the routing number for whatever pathetic dummy account you plan to use. I will transfer the funds right now, and then you are going to walk out of that door and completely vanish from our lives." I rattled off a randomized string of digits connected to a completely untraceable shell account I had created specifically for this exact meeting. Marcus flipped his laptop open. I watched intensely as his fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. He typed in his complex master decryption password and successfully bypassed the secondary biometric firewall. The screen illuminated brightly, revealing the highly secured, heavily encrypted financial dashboard of his failing tech startup. He was fully logged in. The absolute master key to his entire criminal empire was now sitting wide open right in front of me. I needed exactly 45 seconds of uninterrupted physical access to that keyboard. I reached out with both of my hands, pretending to gratefully grab his forearm to humbly thank him for his incredible generosity. But as I reached across the table, my seemingly clumsy, trembling elbow slammed violently into the side of my steaming, oversized mug of black coffee. The heavy ceramic mug tipped over instantly, sending a massive scalding wave of boiling hot liquid directly across the table and straight into Marcus's lap. Marcus let out a deafening, high-pitched scream of pure, absolute agony as the boiling coffee soaked instantly through the expensive fabric of his tailored suit trousers. He violently pushed himself backward, sliding wildly out of the booth and leaping to his feet in the middle of the crowded cafe. He danced frantically, grabbing at his burning thighs and cursing at the absolute top of his lungs. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he roared, his perfectly curated CEO persona completely shattering into a screaming, furious mess. Jessica shrieked, jumping out of the booth to avoid the spreading liquid and frantically grabbing huge fistfuls of brown paper napkins from the nearby condiment station. The entire coffee shop completely erupted into total chaos. Customers were turning their heads. Baristas were shouting, asking loudly if everyone was okay, and Jessica was frantically trying to dab the scalding liquid off her screaming husband's legs. Every single pair of eyes in the bustling room was fixed entirely on Marcus. No one was looking at me. I did not hesitate for a single microsecond. The terrified, trembling victim completely vanished. My hands shot out across the table, moving with the blinding, lethal speed of a seasoned forensic auditor. I grabbed the edge of his sleek silver laptop, pulling it swiftly toward me over the spreading puddle of spilled coffee. His administrative dashboard was still completely unlocked and active. I reached into my sleeve and pulled out a tiny modified flash drive I had specially programmed the night before in the Apex Sterling Secure Security Lab. I shoved the drive firmly into the side port of his machine. My fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard, bypassing his standard user interface and opening the hidden background command terminal. I did not need to hunt for the files manually. My custom Ghost script was explicitly designed to automatically hunt, isolate, and perfectly clone the exact digital architecture of his offshore criminal syndicate. I watched the black terminal screen absolutely blaze with rapidly scrolling lines of vivid green text. The script aggressively bypassed his secondary firewalls, diving straight into the heavily encrypted root directory. It isolated his dual ledgers, perfectly capturing the immense hidden discrepancies between his completely fake investor reports and his actual stolen offshore wealth. It secured the exact Cayman Island routing numbers, mapping out the entire geographic flow of the stolen $5 million. And then it hit the absolute ultimate jackpot. It downloaded the deep internal IP logs from his home network, the exact undeniable digital footprint proving unconditionally that Jessica had been illegally logging into my personal accounts from their mansion while I was physically at work. It was undeniable, hard-coded proof of their elaborate forgery. The glowing progress bar on the terminal screen hit 100%. Exactly 38 seconds had passed. I forcefully yanked the flash drive out of the side port and slipped it deep into the hidden pocket of my baggy gray sweater. I quickly cleared the command terminal, hitting a rapid sequence of keys to instantly wipe my digital footprint from his active session, making it look exactly like the machine had simply gone to sleep during the chaotic, violent commotion. I shoved the laptop back across the table, just as Marcus stopped screaming, and turned back to violently glare at me with dark eyes full of absolute murderous rage. "You stupid, clumsy, pathetic loser!" He spat viciously, grabbing his laptop off the table and furiously inspecting the metal casing to make absolutely sure no coffee had splashed onto the delicate keyboard. "You cannot even do one simple thing right without completely ruining it." He aggressively slammed the laptop shut and shoved it forcefully back into his expensive leather bag. "The $10,000 is in your dummy account. If I ever see your pathetic face in Chicago again, I will personally call the federal agents myself." He grabbed Jessica tightly by the arm and stormed angrily out of the coffee shop, leaving a long trail of wet coffee drips across the polished floor. The bell above the door chimed softly as they completely disappeared onto the busy city street. I sat perfectly still in the quiet corner booth, surrounded entirely by soggy brown napkins and the strong, bitter smell of spilled dark coffee. My hand drifted down slowly into the deep pocket of my oversized sweater, my fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, solid plastic of the secure flash drive. Marcus honestly thought he had just successfully bought his absolute freedom for $10,000 and a ruined pair of suit pants. He confidently thought he was walking away, a victorious multimillionaire. He had absolutely no idea that he had just willingly handed the entire criminal blueprint of his perfectly stolen empire directly to the very woman who was about to lock him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. I walked out of the coffee shop and hailed a taxi to the towering glass headquarters of Apex Sterling Holdings. My fingers remained tightly curled around the encrypted flash drive, resting deep inside my oversized sweater pocket. It felt like holding a live grenade perfectly designed to obliterate the fraudulent empire my sister and her husband had built on my stolen identity. I walked through the grand marble lobby, swiping my executive security badge, and took the private elevator directly to the secure sublevel. The environment down there was an absolute fortress of frosted glass, soundproof walls, and rows of high-powered, air-gapped computer terminals entirely isolated from the main corporate network. I sat down at my dedicated workstation and locked the heavy glass door. I carefully plugged the flash drive directly into the secure terminal. The screens immediately flared to life, casting a sharp, pale blue light across my face. My hands flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, lethal precision. I initiated a sequence of advanced decryption protocols and specialized forensic extraction scripts I had personally designed for the firm. I watched intensely as Marcus' entire digital life was completely gutted and laid bare across my 3 oversized monitors. He thought he was a brilliant mastermind hiding behind military-grade encryption, but looking at his raw data, I realized he was just an arrogant amateur who left a massive glowing digital trail leading straight back to his front door. The left monitor populated with the primary master ledger he had meticulously hidden beneath layers of dummy code. The middle monitor displayed the exact chronological timeline of every single fraudulent wire transfer originating from the multi-million-dollar commercial loans he had secured, using my forged signature and pristine credit score. The right monitor pulled up his itemized personal expenditure reports. As I began to cross-reference the dates and the massive offshore withdrawals, the cold mechanical focus of my forensic training briefly faltered, replaced by a sickening, overwhelming wave of pure physical revulsion. I sat perfectly still, staring at the undeniable, irrefutable proof of their absolute depravity. The $5 million they had systematically stolen in my name was not just desperate seed money to artificially inflate a failing tech startup. It was a massive bottomless slush fund for their own sickening personal vanity. I mapped out the excruciating truth line by agonizing line. Exactly 3 days after the very first fraudulent $1.2 million commercial loan was approved, using my completely forged signature, there was a massive outgoing wire transfer for $85,000. I traced the routing number directly to a private high-end jeweler in the Diamond District. It was the exact same jeweler where Marcus had proudly purchased Jessica Massive's 6-carat flawless diamond engagement ring, the same ring she loved to wave in my face at family dinners, offering me condescending pity for my boring accounting career. I felt my stomach physically twist as I traced the next major transaction. 4 weeks after the second fraudulent loan cleared a shell company in the Cayman Islands, authorized a direct payment of $3.2 million to an elite real estate escrow account. I pulled up the digitized property deed attached to the transaction, and hot bile rose directly in my throat. It was the sprawling 6-bedroom mansion with the heated marble floors and the grand sweeping staircase. The very same house where I had spent countless exhausted hours cooking their lavish dinners. The very same house where Jessica had violently screamed at me, calling me a pathetic broke burden before physically dragging my only suitcase down the stairs and shoving me out into a freezing thunderstorm. They had literally evicted me from a luxury estate secretly purchased using my own stolen identity and financial ruin. Every single piece of custom furniture, every expensive bottle of imported bourbon Marcus casually swirled every silk sheet they slept on was entirely funded by the systematic destruction of my life. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty was almost impossible to process. I traced $500,000 funneled through a Swiss holding account that went straight toward the purchase of 2 custom-ordered imported luxury sports cars. I watched the digital trail document their lavish first-class vacations, their exorbitant country club initiation fees, and their endless designer wardrobe upgrades. They had essentially treated my pristine financial record like an infinite magical credit card, running up massive catastrophic debts in my name while actively treating me like a subhuman peasant. The little sister I had scrubbed corporate toilets to protect had gleefully worn diamonds bought with my stolen future. I leaned back heavily in my ergonomic desk chair, letting the cold and sterile silence of the secure room completely wash over me. The initial sickening shock slowly evaporated, leaving behind a vast freezing ocean of pure lethal calculation. The terrified crying victim they thought they had abandoned in a parking lot was completely dead. The woman sitting in front of these glowing screens was the ultimate apex predator of the financial world, and it was time to absolutely destroy their stolen universe. I cracked my knuckles, rolled my shoulders back, and reached for the secure encrypted telephone sitting on the corner of my desk. I did not need to involve the local police detectives or wait for a slow public prosecutor to issue a formal subpoena. I had direct high-level back-channel access to the most elite international banking compliance boards on the planet. I placed my first heavily encrypted call to a senior compliance director at a major offshore banking institution in the Cayman Islands. I identified myself using my official Apex Sterling Holdings executive credentials and invoked the International Fraud Prevention Act. I transmitted the undeniable forensic proof of the wire fraud directly to their secure servers, highlighting the exact shell accounts Marcus was using to hide the stolen capital. The compliance director did not hesitate or ask for a court order. The sheer magnitude of the evidence and the absolute power of Apex Sterling Holdings behind my request was more than enough. Within exactly 6 minutes, the director verbally confirmed that a complete hard digital freeze had been instantly applied to the primary offshore holding accounts. The money was officially locked in an impenetrable digital vault. I did not stop there. I worked with methodical, relentless speed, executing a perfectly coordinated global financial strike. I contacted the regulatory compliance officers in Zurich, Geneva, and the British Virgin Islands. I systematically traced every single shadow account, every dummy corporation, and every hidden asset fund Marcus had so carefully constructed. I submitted the ironclad proof of extreme identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and international wire fraud to every single banking authority. One by one, the glowing green active status icons on my specialized tracking software turned a solid, vibrant red. Red meant frozen. Red meant completely paralyzed. Red meant absolute, total, unmitigated annihilation. I tracked down the domestic accounts, holding the operational funds for his failing tech startup. I flagged them for severe suspicious activity, linking them directly to the stolen Apex Sterling venture capital. I triggered an automatic anti-money laundering protocol that completely locked the domestic servers. Marcus had foolishly believed transferring $10,000 into my dummy account would buy his absolute freedom. He thought he was incredibly smart, offering me pennies while he sat on millions of stolen money. He had absolutely no idea that while he was storming out of the coffee shop, loudly cursing about his ruined tailored suit, I was actively placing heavy, impenetrable digital padlocks on every single penny he thought he owned. I sat back and watched the final offshore account icon turn a bright flashing red on my center monitor. The entire process had taken less than 3 hours. The magnificent financial empire Marcus and Jessica had built entirely on my stolen identity was now completely paralyzed. They could not wire a single dollar. They could not access their massive cash reserves. The $5 million they had stolen was trapped in a frozen void, waiting to be legally seized and repatriated by my firm. They were functionally bankrupt. A slow, deeply satisfied smile finally touched the very corners of my mouth. Marcus and Jessica were currently driving around the city in their stolen luxury cars, completely oblivious to the fact that they were already financially dead. The true beauty of the trap was that they would not realize the catastrophe until they tried to access their funds. I leaned forward and officially saved the complete forensic data packet onto the highly secured internal company server, preparing the final lethal blow for my chief executive officer. The noose was completely tight, and now all I had to do was wait for Marcus and Jessica to desperately kick away the chair. Their incredibly beautiful, completely fake lives were officially fully over, and I was absolutely ready to watch them fall. The grand ballroom of the magnificent downtown Chicago luxury hotel was a breathtaking spectacle of extreme corporate wealth and perfectly curated high society glamour. Massive crystal chandeliers hung heavily from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow across the expansive room. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays lined with crystal flutes of imported vintage champagne and delicate, expensive hors d'oeuvres. A live string quartet played a soft, elegant symphony in the corner, providing the perfect, sophisticated background noise for the wealthy elite of the city to mingle. It was a flawless picture of absolute success and undeniable power. It was also an entire universe built completely on a foundation of malicious lies and stolen money. I stood quietly in the deep shadows of the curved mezzanine balcony, looking down at the lavish black tie fundraising gala unfolding perfectly beneath me. I was wearing an immaculate tailored black evening gown that allowed me to blend seamlessly into the wealthy crowd. My hands rested calmly on the cool marble railing as I watched my brother-in-law orchestrate his absolute masterpiece of deception. Marcus was hosting this incredibly lavish event with one singular, desperate goal in mind. He needed to secure a massive new $10 million capital injection from the most elite private investors in Chicago. His fraudulent tech startup was secretly bleeding cash, and he required this massive influx of legitimate funding to cover his tracks and continuously inflate his towering corporate Ponzi scheme. He was actively working the room with the practiced, effortless charm of a seasoned predator. He glided smoothly between the scattered cocktail tables, shaking hands with billionaire venture capitalists, clapping powerful hedge fund managers on the shoulder, and flashing his brilliant, charismatic smile. He projected an aura of absolute invincibility. He looked exactly like a visionary tech founder who was about to change the entire world. He looked like a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. Across the magnificent ballroom, holding court near a towering sculpture of imported white orchids, was my younger sister. Jessica looked absolutely radiant. She was wearing a custom-designed emerald green silk gown that clung perfectly to her figure, but it was not the expensive dress that caught the harsh light of the chandeliers. It was the diamonds. She was literally dripping in flawless, brilliant cut diamonds. A massive, glittering necklace rested heavily against her collarbone, perfectly matching the heavy diamond drop earrings framing her beautiful face. I stared at those sparkling stones from the dark balcony and felt a slow, cold wave of pure, lethal disgust wash over my entire body. I knew exactly where those diamonds came from. I knew the exact offshore routing numbers and the specific fraudulent commercial loans used to purchase every single carat. She was standing in the middle of a high society gala, proudly wearing jewelry bought exclusively with my stolen identity and my completely ruined financial future. I watched intensely as Jessica leaned in close to a small, tight circle of wealthy socialite wives. She raised a manicured hand to her chest, dramatically touching the diamonds as she spoke in a low, conspiratorial whisper. Her face was a perfectly constructed mask of brave, tragic sorrow. I did not need to be standing directly next to her to know exactly what venomous lies she was actively feeding them. I could read the fake tragedy in her posture and see the sympathetic pity washing over the faces of the wealthy women listening to her. She was telling them the heartbreaking, deeply fabricated story of her deeply troubled older sister. She was telling them about me. She was carefully planting the seeds of my absolute destruction into the minds of the Chicago elite. She was likely whispering about how she and Marcus had tried so incredibly hard to help me. She was spinning a tragic tale about how they had generously brought me into their beautiful mansion, only to tragically discover that I was a bitter, jealous criminal who actively abused their blind trust. She was telling them with fake tears shimmering in her bright blue eyes that I had just been forcefully arrested by federal agents for orchestrating a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. She was playing the ultimate, perfectly crafted victim. The women around her gasped softly, shaking their heads in profound disbelief and reaching out to pat her arm with genuine comforting sympathy. They were completely captivated by her performance. They honestly believed they were comforting a brave, loving sister who had just survived a horrific family betrayal. They had absolutely no idea that the real victim was currently standing on the balcony above them, watching their entire fake reality play out with the cold, calculating precision of a senior forensic auditor. They did not know that the beautiful crying woman in the emerald gown had systematically butchered her own sister's life just to secure those sparkling diamonds. My eyes shifted back to Marcus. He was currently standing in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 incredibly powerful local investors. He was laughing loudly at a joke, throwing his head back with pure, unadulterated arrogance. He was practically vibrating with victorious energy. He honestly believed he had achieved the absolute perfect crime. In his deeply narcissistic mind, he had successfully outsmarted the federal investigators, the corporate banking systems, and the entire executive board of Apex Sterling Holdings. He believed he had permanently buried me under a mountain of insurmountable criminal evidence, and secured his own total freedom by throwing me directly to the wolves. He thought I was currently sitting in a cold, damp holding cell, crying hysterically and begging a cheap public defender to negotiate a lenient prison sentence. He had absolutely no idea that I had posted my bail hours ago. He had no idea that I had already marched into the towering glass headquarters of my firm and laid his entire criminal syndicate completely bare across the mahogany desk of my chief executive officer. And most importantly, Marcus had absolutely zero idea that his incredibly complex offshore banking network was entirely paralyzed. While he was busy renting this massive ballroom, hiring the expensive string quartet, and buying vintage champagne to impress these elite investors, I had spent the last 48 hours executing a flawless, silent financial strike. I had systematically contacted the highest international banking compliance boards on the planet. I had successfully frozen every single ghost account, every hidden shell company, and every single illicit trust fund he had built using my forged signature. The millions of dollars he thought he had perfectly hidden in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands were currently locked inside an impenetrable digital vault. He was officially entirely bankrupt. He was a dead man walking wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, but he would not realize the catastrophic truth until he actually attempted to move a single penny of that stolen money. The soft, elegant music of the string quartet suddenly faded into a respectful silence. The heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed slightly, casting a dramatic theatrical spotlight directly onto the grand stage at the far end of the lavish ballroom. A low murmur of eager anticipation rolled through the massive crowd of wealthy investors as the master of ceremonies stepped up to the polished wooden podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, his deep professional voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "Tonight we are not just celebrating the incredible rapid success of a revolutionary technology company. We are celebrating the brilliant visionary mind behind it. Please direct your attention to the stage and join me in welcoming the founder and chief executive officer, Marcus Hayes." The entire ballroom completely erupted into a massive wave of thunderous applause. Wealthy investors and influential socialites cheered loudly, raising their expensive crystal champagne flutes in the air to salute the man of the hour. Marcus stepped away from his group of admirers, buttoning his tailored jacket with a smooth, practiced motion. He flashed a brilliant, triumphant smile at Jessica, who blew him a glamorous kiss from across the room. He walked confidently toward the stage, basking completely in the blinding glow of their absolute adoration. This was the exact moment he had been waiting for. This was the glorious, triumphant climax of his elaborate multi-million-dollar scheme. He was preparing to take the microphone and publicly finalize the massive new $10 million investment contracts right there on the stage. He genuinely believed that securing these final signatures would permanently legitimize his fake empire and forcefully wash away any lingering trace of his massive corporate fraud. He thought the new venture capital would smoothly refill the stolen accounts before the federal authorities could ever connect the final dots. He believed he had completely won the game. I stood perfectly still in the dark shadows of the mezzanine balcony, my hands resting lightly on the cold marble railing. I watched him climb the short steps to the stage, waving graciously to the cheering crowd. He walked directly up to the microphone stand, looking out over the sea of wealthy, powerful people he intended to actively defraud. The absolute sheer arrogance of his smiling face made my blood run completely cold. He had destroyed my life, stolen my identity, and literally thrown me out into a freezing storm to face decades in a federal penitentiary without a single moment of human hesitation or regret. He thought I was completely erased. He thought he was untouchable. As Marcus grasped the microphone and took a deep, dramatic breath to begin his victorious keynote speech, a slow, lethal smile spread across my face. I remained completely hidden in the darkness, watching the final seconds of his perfect stolen life tick away. He was standing at the absolute peak of his fraudulent mountain, completely unaware that the entire foundation had already been completely blown to dust. He was about to ask for $10 million from the most powerful men in Chicago, and he had absolutely no idea that the financial guillotine was already dropping straight down toward his neck. I turned away from this cold marble railing of the mezzanine balcony and walked slowly toward the heavy velvet curtains that masked the exit. The time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. For 28 years, I had actively made myself incredibly small. I had quieted my voice, lowered my head, and swallowed my own basic needs so my younger sister could shine brightly in the center of the room. I had allowed my family to completely dictate my worth, reducing my entire existence to a convenient, reliable stepping stone. Just days ago, I had been a shivering, terrified victim, thrown out into a freezing thunderstorm and shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle. I had believed their narrative. I had believed I was nothing. But as I walked down the sweeping grand staircase of the luxury hotel, moving gracefully in my immaculate, tailored black evening gown, I realized that the frightened, accommodating older sister was completely dead. The woman descending those carpeted stairs was a senior forensic auditor who held the absolute power to dismantle empires, and she was fully prepared to burn this fraudulent universe to the absolute ground. I reached the expansive grand foyer, located just outside the main mahogany doors of the lavish ballroom. The space was completely quiet, insulated from the loud cheering and applause echoing from the stage inside. Waiting for me in the center of the intricately patterned carpet was a group of incredibly imposing figures. There were 3 elite armed agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission standing in absolute silence. They were not local precinct cops working a standard beat. They were high-level federal investigators specializing exclusively in massive corporate embezzlement and catastrophic financial crimes. They wore sharp, dark suits, but the undeniable bulge of their tactical holsters and the heavy gold badges clipped to their belts communicated an aura of absolute terrifying authority. They moved with the cold, mechanical precision of predators who had completely cornered their prey. Standing right beside them was Jonathan Vance, the incredibly ruthless lead legal counsel for Apex Sterling Holdings. Jonathan was a corporate shark who terrified even the most arrogant billionaire venture capitalists in Chicago. He was holding a thick black leather portfolio that contained every single page of the devastating forensic trap I had meticulously built over the last 72 hours. It held the frozen offshore routing numbers, the cloned dual ledgers, the illegally forged loan applications, and the undeniable hard-coded digital footprints proving exactly where the stolen $5 million had gone. Jonathan looked up as I approached, and a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across his sharp face. He nodded his head in deep, profound respect, acknowledging the sheer absolute genius of the financial cage I had successfully constructed. The digital freezes completely locked down across all international boards. "Harper," he said, his voice a low, rumbling hum of pure corporate power. "The Cayman accounts are paralyzed. The Swiss holding nodes are officially seized. Marcus Hayes currently has less than $14 of legally accessible liquid capital to his entire name. The federal warrants have been fully signed and executed by the presiding judge. We are completely ready whenever you are." I looked at Jonathan, and then I looked at the 3 armed federal agents flanking him. This was my true reality. This was the terrifying, unstoppable force I commanded every single day at Apex Sterling Holdings, while my sister and her husband mockingly called me a broke, pathetic clerk. They had absolutely no idea the level of sheer, absolute hell they had foolishly invited into their perfectly curated lives. "Open the doors," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, perfectly steady and lethally calm. "Let us go introduce ourselves to the investors." The 2 massive brass-handled mahogany doors of the grand ballroom were violently pulled open by the hotel staff. They swung wide, revealing the breathtaking spectacle of the black tie fundraising gala. The live string quartet was still playing softly in the corner, and the room was completely packed with the most elite wealthy socialites and powerful investors in the entire city of Chicago. Marcus was standing proudly on the brightly lit stage, holding a microphone and smiling arrogantly at the adoring crowd, preparing to deliver his final pitch for the massive $10 million capital injection he desperately needed to cover his crimes. I stepped through the threshold and walked directly into the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. I was immediately flanked by Jonathan Vance and the 3 armed federal agents, forming an impenetrable moving wall of absolute authority. The sheer physical impact of our entrance was instantaneous. I was not wearing the damp, wrinkled sweater and cheap canvas sneakers they had seen me wearing during my humiliating arrest at the police precinct. I was wearing an elegant, perfectly structured designer gown that radiated quiet, undeniable wealth and supreme confidence. I walked with my head held high, my posture completely straight, my face an unreadable mask of cold, terrifying calculation. The heavy footfalls of the federal agents echoed loudly against the polished marble floor, cutting sharply through the soft, elegant music of the string quartet. The wealthy guests standing near the entrance immediately stopped talking. The loud, cheerful murmurs and the pleasant clinking of crystal champagne flutes completely died away as we moved purposefully through the crowd. People naturally instinctively parted to make way for the armed federal agents, sensing the overwhelming aura of danger and impending destruction. A heavy, suffocating silence began to spread rapidly across the massive ballroom like a sudden violent drop in barometric pressure before a catastrophic hurricane. Investors turned their heads, lowering their drinks, their expressions shifting from polite amusement to profound, absolute confusion. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, keeping my eyes completely fixed on the stage. I did not look at the wealthy socialites whispering behind their hands. I did not look at the confused hedge fund managers. I just kept moving methodically forward, closing the distance between the grand entrance and the man who had tried to systematically destroy my entire existence. Across the room, standing near the towering display of white orchids, Jessica suddenly stopped mid-sentence. She had been actively holding court, surrounded by the very same wealthy women she had been manipulating with her tragic, fabricated story about my fake criminal arrest. She turned her head, glancing casually toward the sudden ripple of absolute silence, spreading through the crowd. When her bright blue eyes finally locked onto me, her entire body violently flinched, as if she had been physically struck by a massive bolt of lightning. The perfectly constructed mask of the brave, tragic victim instantly completely shattered. Her mouth dropped open in an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She stared wildly at my immaculate designer gown. She stared at the incredibly expensive tailored suit of the ruthless corporate lawyer walking beside me. She stared at the 3 armed federal agents with their gold badges gleaming harshly in the chandelier light. Her brain completely short-circuited, attempting to process the absolute impossibility of the scene unfolding right in front of her. In her deeply narcissistic, highly delusional reality, I was currently rotting in a filthy concrete holding cell, weeping hysterically and entirely defeated by their brilliant mastermind plot. I was supposed to be the pathetic, broken fall guy, bearing the total crushing weight of their multi-million-dollar embezzlement. I was absolutely not supposed to be marching into her elite high society gala, flanked by federal investigators looking like an untouchable corporate queen. The shock quickly morphed into a frantic, bubbling, entitled fury. Jessica could not comprehend the truth, so she instantly reverted to her deeply ingrained habit of demanding absolute control. She excused herself from the circle of confused socialites and marched aggressively through the parting crowd, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her custom emerald silk gown swished violently around her ankles, and the stolen diamonds glittering on her neck practically vibrated with her rising panic. She intercepted my path exactly 20 feet from the edge of the stage, actively blocking my way with her body. Her face was flushed dark red with extreme anger, and her eyes were wide with a terrifying, desperate madness. She honestly believed she could somehow still control the narrative. She believed she could simply order me out of her fake, perfect reality, just like she had shoved me out of her stolen mansion. "What the hell are you doing here?" She hissed, her voice a venomous, frantic whisper, completely desperate to keep the surrounding investors from hearing her panic. "You are supposed to be in jail. You are a federal criminal, Harper. You are completely out of your mind coming here." She frantically spun around wildly, waving her manicured hand toward a group of large hotel security guards standing near the catering exit. "Security," she demanded, raising her voice just enough to sound panicked and threatened. "Security, you need to remove this woman right now. She is a dangerous felon. She is completely unstable, and she is actively trespassing on a private corporate event. Get her out of here immediately." The hotel security guards immediately hesitated, completely unsure of what to do. They took one single look at the three incredibly imposing federal agents standing solidly behind me, with their hands resting casually near their tactical holsters, and they wisely decided to stay exactly where they were. Nobody was going to touch me. Nobody was going to throw me out into the rain ever again. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, allowing Jessica to completely unravel right in front of me. I looked at the massive, flawless diamond necklace resting heavily against her collarbone. I knew the exact offshore transaction number used to purchase those stolen stones. I looked at her frantic, terrified eyes, watching the absolute desperate realization slowly, painfully claw its way into her brain. She suddenly realized that the agents were not here to arrest me. They were here with me. Jessica took a shaky, stumbling step backward, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Her hands flew up to her chest, clutching the stolen diamonds as if she could physically protect her fake, fraudulent wealth from evaporating into thin air. "Harper," she gasped, her voice completely cracking, losing all of its arrogant venom. "Harper, what is going on? What are you doing?" I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or cry or stoop to her level of frantic, desperate hysteria. I simply reached out and gracefully plucked a crystal flute of vintage imported champagne off the silver tray of a completely paralyzed waiter standing frozen nearby. I stepped forward, completely invading her personal space, closing the distance between us until I was looking directly down into her terrified, panicked eyes. I held the crystal flute out, extending it deliberately toward her trembling hands. I looked at the woman who had stolen my identity, forged my signature on $5 million of fraudulent loans, and purposefully tried to send me to a maximum security prison just so she could play dress-up in high society. I looked at the sister I had scrubbed toilets to protect, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold terminal closure. I pressed the cool crystal glass directly into her shaking fingers. "Enjoy the show," I whispered. Marcus stood at the center of the brightly lit stage, gripping the heavy microphone with both hands. He gazed out over the sea of wealthy investors with a practiced, brilliant smile that perfectly masked his absolute desperation. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the quiet, expectant audience. He took a deep theatrical breath and began speaking in his smooth, charismatic voice. He talked about vision. He talked about the future of technology and how his revolutionary startup was on the very brink of completely changing the global market. He told the crowd that they were not just investing in a company, but they were actively securing a legacy. He paced the stage with the effortless grace of a seasoned performer, gesturing toward the massive blank projector screen hanging directly behind him. He promised them unprecedented returns and guaranteed wealth. He had the entire room eating directly out of the palm of his hand. He was just moments away from officially opening the floor to secure the $10 million he so desperately needed to keep his fraudulent empire afloat. He raised his hand and confidently clicked the small black remote to pull up his highly anticipated financial pitch deck. The massive projector hummed to life, but the bright screen did not display his perfectly designed corporate logo. It did not show his fake projected revenue graphs or his fabricated user acquisition metrics. Instead, the massive screen flashed a blinding stark white. Then a highly detailed, complex financial document appeared stretched 20 feet across the wall. It was a perfectly cloned image of the primary commercial loan application Marcus had fraudulently secured using my stolen identity. My forged signature was magnified to the size of a luxury car, glowing brightly for every single billionaire in the room to see. Marcus stopped mid-sentence. His charismatic smile faltered. He aggressively mashed the button on his remote clicker, completely desperate to change the slide. He let out a nervous, awkward chuckle into the microphone, attempting to play it off as a simple technical glitch to the increasingly confused audience. But the slide did not change. The massive forged document remained completely frozen on the screen. That is when I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly up the short wooden stairs to the grand stage. The sharp, confident click of my heels echoed loudly against the polished floorboards, cutting right through the uncomfortable silence of the ballroom. Marcus turned his head to look at me, and his entire body went perfectly rigid. The heavy color drained instantly from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared at my immaculate navy blue designer blazer and my perfectly styled hair. His dark eyes darted frantically toward the 3 armed federal agents and the ruthless corporate lawyer who had silently moved to secure every single exit around the stage. He realized with a sudden violent jolt of pure panic that he had absolutely no control over this situation. I walked smoothly across the stage, closing the distance between us. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was completely paralyzed. He instinctively took a slow, stumbling step backward. I reached out and firmly took the microphone right out of his trembling hands. He did not even try to stop me. He was completely trapped in a state of absolute shock. I turned my back on him and faced the massive crowd of incredibly powerful investors. The room was completely dead silent. You could literally hear the quiet rustle of expensive silk gowns and the sharp intake of breath from the front row. I looked directly out into the sea of bewildered faces, and I spoke with a voice of absolute icy perfection. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice ringing crystal clear across the silent ballroom. "My name is Harper Hayes. I am the Senior Forensic Auditor for Apex Sterling Holdings. I specialize exclusively in dismantling highly sophisticated corporate embezzlement syndicates and tracking stolen venture capital." A loud collective gasp rippled violently through the wealthy crowd. The elite hedge fund managers and seasoned venture capitalists instantly straightened in their chairs, their sharp financial instincts immediately locking onto the gravity of my words. They knew exactly what Apex Sterling Holdings was. They knew the terrifying reputation of my firm. And they knew that a senior forensic auditor only ever showed up when millions of dollars had been catastrophically stolen. "Mr. Hayes invited you all here tonight to ask for $10 million of your hard-earned capital." I continued slowly pacing the stage with complete, unshakable authority. "He promised you unprecedented returns. He told you his company was on the brink of revolutionizing the tech industry. But the truth is, his company is nothing but a hollow, desperate shell. It has absolutely zero functional product. It has zero legitimate revenue. The only thing Marcus Hayes has successfully built over the past 2 years is a massive, highly illegal corporate Ponzi scheme designed entirely to fund his own personal, lavish vanity." I raised a small black remote in my hand and clicked the button. The massive projector screen behind me instantly shifted. The forged loan document completely vanished, replaced by a stark, undeniable timeline. The screen displayed a meticulously organized digital map showing exactly how $5 million of Apex Sterling venture capital had been systematically drained from our secure portfolios. For the past 6 months, my team at Apex Sterling has been aggressively tracking a massive phantom leak within our primary investment funds. I told the completely captivated audience. $5 million completely vanished, masked by layers of brilliant corporate obfuscation. Mr. Hayes believed he was incredibly smart. He bypassed our internal security triggers by completely stealing the financial identity of an innocent person. He utilized a pristine 800 credit score to secure the funds and then rapidly funneled the stolen cash through an incredibly complex network of offshore dummy corporations. I clicked the remote again. The screen flashed, illuminating a massive detailed list of international routing numbers. The bright red text clearly highlighted accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and the British Virgin Islands. "These are the exact offshore holding accounts, currently hiding your stolen money," I explained, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade. Or rather, I should say, these are the accounts that were hiding the money. As of 3 hours ago, I have personally contacted the International Banking Compliance Boards. Every single account you see on this screen has been completely forcefully frozen by federal regulatory authorities. Marcus Hayes is entirely bankrupt. He cannot move a single penny of the $5 million he stole, and he certainly cannot offer you any return on the $10 million he tried to steal from you tonight. A wave of furious, outraged murmuring swept rapidly across the vast ballroom. Powerful billionaires were angrily putting down their champagne flutes and glaring fiercely at Marcus. He was standing completely frozen near the back of the stage, sweating profusely, perfectly aware that his entire life was completely over. But I was not finished. I had to ensure that the complete truth of their absolute malice was fully exposed to the light. I turned my attention directly to the center of the room where my younger sister was sitting. Jessica was still clutching her massive diamond necklace, her face buried in her hands, weeping hysterically as her carefully curated high society life completely crumbled into dust. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen behind me shifted to display a massive, highly detailed series of digital server logs. The bright green text highlighted specific IP addresses, timestamps, and verified geographic locations. Mr. Hayes did not execute this massive fraud entirely on his own, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal register. He needed someone with intimate access to the stolen identity. He needed an accomplice who knew the security answers, the personal details, and the exact behavioral patterns of the victim. I pointed my finger directly at the massive screen. These are the verified internal network logs downloaded directly from Mr. Hayes' highly encrypted personal laptop just a few hours ago, I declared. They provide absolute, undeniable, hard-coded proof. The fraudulent loan applications, the offshore transfers, and the stolen identity verifications were not initiated from a random hacking server. They were initiated directly from the private wireless network inside the luxury mansion owned by Marcus and Jessica Hayes. The wealthy women sitting around Jessica instantly physically recoiled, leaning aggressively away from her as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. The looks of sympathetic pity they had given her just moments ago completely morphed into expressions of pure, absolute disgust. Jessica actively forged my signature while sitting comfortably in her stolen luxury estate, I told the silent, horrified crowd. She used the stolen $5 million to buy the diamonds currently hanging around her neck. She bought custom sports cars and threw lavish parties. And when the federal agents finally began to close in on their massive syndicate, she and Marcus orchestrated a perfectly fake domestic dispute. They forcefully evicted me from their home, completely empty-handed, and purposefully sent the federal authorities directly to my location. They intended for me to take the absolute fall for their entire criminal enterprise, while they walked away completely free with your money. I lowered the remote and looked directly down at my sister. She was totally exposed, completely ruined, and absolutely trapped in her own web of devastating lies. My name is Harper Hayes, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. I am not a desperate rogue accountant. I am not a jealous, bitter sister. And I am certainly not the criminal mastermind behind this fraudulent syndicate. I am the apex predator of the financial world, and I have just successfully locked both of these absolute monsters in a permanent, inescapable digital cage. The ballroom remained perfectly, completely silent for a few lingering seconds as the incredibly heavy reality of my presentation fully washed over the audience. Then, a single slow clap broke the silence. It came from the front row. A seasoned billionaire venture capitalist stood to his feet, slowly clapping his hands together in profound, ultimate respect. Within moments, the entire room erupted. The applause was not polite or celebratory. It was fierce, deafening, and aggressively vindicating. The elite investors of Chicago were actively cheering for the complete destruction of the man who had just tried to rob them blind. I handed the microphone back to a completely broken, paralyzed Marcus. He did not even look at me. He just stared blankly out at the furious, angry faces of the very people he had desperately tried to impress. The 3 armed federal agents smoothly stepped forward onto the stage, completely surrounding him. I turned my back on my former family and walked calmly, gracefully off the stage, leaving their completely shattered universe burning brilliantly behind me. I learned a very hard, painful lesson about family and boundaries. Never let anyone shrink your worth or make you the victim of their own greed. You always have the power to take your life back. If you enjoyed watching me tear down their fraudulent empire, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments exactly what city you are watching from and what time it is right now. Thank you so much for listening to my truth. The silence in the grand ballroom held for exactly 3 heartbeats before the dam completely broke. The seasoned billionaire venture capitalist standing in the front row, the man who had initiated the slow clap, reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke tuxedo. He pulled out the pristine, heavy cardstock folder containing the $10 million letter of intent. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, he gripped the top of the contract and tore it straight down the middle. The sharp tearing sound of the thick paper echoed loudly over the ambient noise of the crowd. He tossed the torn halves directly onto the polished wooden stage, landing right at Marcus's feet. That single violent action was the absolute catalyst. The entire ballroom erupted into unmitigated chaos. Wealthy investors began shouting furiously, waving their arms, and demanding their previous investments back. Women in designer gowns who had just been fawning over my sister backed away rapidly as if the very air around the founders was highly toxic. They watched in sheer, absolute horror as their exclusive high society gala transformed into a brutal crime scene. The 3 federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission did not rush. They did not shout. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized precision of men who held the absolute, unquestionable power of the United States government. They stepped up onto the stage, flanking Marcus on all sides, forming a tight, inescapable triangle. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with steel gray hair, reached inside his dark suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal documents. The federal arrest warrants had been fully signed and executed. Marcus backed away, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest. The arrogant, charismatic tech visionary who had just been pacing the stage like a billionaire genius was entirely gone. In his place stood a trembling, pale, pathetic coward, sweating profusely right through the expensive fabric of his custom-tailored suit. He looked out at the furious crowd of elite investors, then down at the federal agents closing in around him. He realized in that exact terrifying second that there was absolutely no corporate loophole, no clever legal maneuver, and no amount of charming manipulation that could possibly save him from decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. And this is where the true ugly nature of a raging narcissist perfectly reveals itself. When the ship finally hits the iceberg and begins to violently sink, the rat does not go down bravely with the ship. The rat will aggressively climb over anyone and everyone to save its own life. Marcus spun around frantically, his dark eyes wide with a desperate, manic survival instinct. He looked directly out into the center of the ballroom and locked his gaze straight onto my younger sister. He raised his shaking hand and pointed his finger directly at Jessica. It was her, he screamed, his voice cracking in absolute terror, echoing loudly through the microphone he had dropped onto the stage floor. She is the mastermind. She did all of it. I had absolutely nothing to do with the forgery. The entire ballroom gasped collectively, completely paralyzed by the sheer cowardice of his public betrayal. Jessica stood perfectly frozen near the towering display of white orchids. The crystal flute of vintage champagne I had just handed to her slipped directly through her trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the expensive liquid splashing across the hem of her custom emerald silk gown. She had the access. Marcus continued screaming wildly at the federal agents, practically begging them to believe his pathetic lies. She is the one who lived with Harper. She knew her social security number. She knew her banking passwords. She is the one who logged into the corporate accounts from our home network. I am just a completely innocent victim of her insane greed. She lied to me. She manipulated me. She forged her own sister's signature because she wanted the diamonds. She wanted the luxury cars. Look at her. Look at the jewelry she is wearing right now. She bought all of that with stolen money. You have to arrest her, not me. I stood quietly near the heavy velvet curtains, watching my sister's entire universe completely shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Jessica's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen white. The man she had violently betrayed her own flesh and blood for the man she had thrown me out into a freezing thunderstorm to protect was currently standing on a public stage, throwing her directly under a massive federal bus just to shave a few years off his impending prison sentence. He was actively begging the government to lock his wife in a concrete cell so he could walk free. Jessica's mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked around the room completely desperate for a single friendly face. She turned toward the tight circle of wealthy socialite wives she had been holding court with just 10 minutes ago, the women she had been actively feeding venomous lies about my fake criminal arrest. But those women were no longer looking at her with sympathetic pity. They were looking at her with pure, absolute, unadulterated disgust. As Jessica reached out a trembling hand toward them, the women literally physically recoiled, stepping backward in their expensive gowns, completely abandoning her in the middle of the ballroom. She was instantly socially dead. She was no longer the glamorous wife of a visionary tech founder. She was just a common greedy thief wearing stolen diamonds. 2 more federal agents dressed in dark tactical windbreakers pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the grand entrance. They did not ask for permission. They marched directly across the center of the ballroom, completely ignoring the gasping millionaires, and walked straight up to Jessica. Jessica Hayes, you are under arrest for severe identity theft, criminal conspiracy, and multi-million-dollar wire fraud. The female agent stated, her voice ringing with absolute cold authority. No, Jessica finally managed to whisper her voice a weak, pathetic croak. No, please, Marcus, tell them. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you did it. But Marcus was already being forcefully pushed against the wooden podium by the lead agent, his hands being roughly pulled behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of solid steel handcuffs echoing across the stage was the only answer he gave her. The female agent grabbed Jessica by the arm, spinning her around with forceful clinical efficiency. Jessica let out a loud sobbing wail as her arms were pulled behind her back. The cold, heavy steel of the federal handcuffs clamped tightly shut, locking securely over the incredibly expensive diamond bracelets she had bought with my stolen future. The sparkling stones bit painfully into her wrists as the agent locked the cuffs in place. "You cannot do this to me!" Jessica cried hysterically, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-streaked face. "I am not a criminal. I am a victim." "Harper, please." "Harper, tell them." She looked wildly through the crowd, desperately searching for me, begging for the very sister she had gleefully discarded. But I did not step forward to save her. I did not offer her a single ounce of mercy. I just stood in the shadows perfectly still, letting her feel the exact same crushing, absolute terror she had forced me to endure in that freezing police precinct. The federal agents did not give her another second to scream. They gripped her tightly by the arms and began forcefully marching her straight down the center aisle of the magnificent ballroom. The incredibly wealthy elite of Chicago stood in absolute silence, watching the ultimate humiliating perp walk. Jessica stumbled in her expensive designer heels, sobbing uncontrollably, the heavy emerald silk of her gown dragging sadly across the spilled champagne and broken glass on the floor. Marcus was marched down from the stage directly behind her, his head bowed in absolute defeat, his ruined coffee-stained trousers perfectly matching the utter destruction of his fraudulent empire. As they were aggressively escorted out of the grand ballroom and pushed through the massive glass doors of the hotel lobby, the blinding flashing red and blue lights of a dozen waiting federal police cruisers washed violently over them. The harsh strobe lights illuminated the stark, terrified reality on their faces. The cameras of local news crews who had been tipped off by my legal team began violently flashing, capturing every single humiliating second of their devastating public arrest. Jessica shrank away from the blinding cameras, weeping loudly into the shoulder of the federal agent pulling her forward. The diamonds around her neck caught the flashing red and blue police lights, sparkling brightly one final time before she was forcefully shoved into the dark, cramped back seat of a heavily armored federal transport vehicle. I watched the heavy steel doors slam shut completely, locking them both inside. The engine roared to life, and the convoy of police cruisers pulled aggressively away from the luxury hotel, disappearing rapidly down the dark city street. The flashing lights slowly faded into the distance, taking the monsters who had tried to destroy my life far away into the cold, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. I took a deep cleansing breath of the cool night air, letting the absolute profound silence of the empty street wash over me. The cage was finally locked. The stolen money was fully recovered, and the terrified, broken victim they had manufactured was gone forever. Justice had not just been served. It had been completely, absolutely weaponized. The heavy glass doors of the grand ballroom swung wide open as the federal agents began their incredibly long march toward the hotel exit. The deafening silence of the Chicago elite followed them every single step of the way. Hundreds of the most powerful and wealthy people in the city stood perfectly still, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the absolute destruction unfolding right in front of their eyes. These were people who understood power, and they were currently witnessing the total, complete annihilation of a woman who had dared to build a fraudulent empire on a foundation of malicious lies. The two agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission held Jessica firmly by both arms. Their grips were highly professional, completely unyielding, and absolutely devoid of any sympathy. They were not treating her like a glamorous high society socialite. They were treating her exactly like the dangerous, desperate federal criminal she had finally been proven to be. As they pushed her forward toward the brightly lit foyer, the reality of her situation finally began to physically crush her. For the past 6 months, Jessica had lived in an incredibly delusional fantasy world. She had convinced herself that she was brilliant, that she was untouchable, and that she was completely entitled to the millions of dollars she had ruthlessly stolen using my identity. She had spent my ruined credit on flawless diamonds and custom luxury cars, believing that she could simply throw me away like a piece of broken trash whenever I became inconvenient to her incredibly lavish lifestyle. But as the cold, heavy steel of the federal handcuffs bit deeply into her delicate wrists, crushing the expensive diamond bracelets she wore, the entire fraudulent facade completely evaporated. The transition was violent and absolute. Jessica began to visibly shake. Her confident, arrogant posture completely collapsed. Her expensive designer heels scraped loudly against the polished marble floor as her legs simply refused to support her own weight. She stumbled heavily, dragging the two federal agents down slightly as she lost all of her remaining physical strength. The agents attempted to pull her back up to her feet, ordering her to keep moving forward, but Jessica was completely unraveling. She let out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed harshly against the vaulted ceilings of the grand hotel lobby. It was not a performative cry designed to manipulate a room full of wealthy investors. It was the raw, terrifying scream of a highly narcissistic woman realizing that her entire perfectly curated life was officially, permanently over. She violently twisted her body, fighting against the unyielding grip of the federal agents. The sheer sudden force of her panic caused her to stumble forward, and she crashed heavily down onto her knees right in the center of the immaculate marble foyer. The incredibly expensive custom emerald green silk gown she had bought with my stolen future tore audibly as her knees hit the hard stone floor. The flawless diamond necklace resting against her collarbone swung wildly, reflecting the harsh, bright lights of the lobby chandeliers. "Get up, ma'am!" The lead agent commanded, his voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any emotion. "You need to stand up and walk outside right now." But Jessica refused to move. She remained completely slumped on the cold marble floor, sobbing hysterically. Her chest heaved with violent, frantic breaths as she looked wildly around the massive, empty space separating her from the ballroom. The flashing, bright red and blue lights of the waiting federal police cruisers, parked just outside the front glass doors, cast an eerie, terrifying strobe effect across her tear-streaked face. She knew exactly what was waiting for her inside those armored vehicles. She knew it meant a cold, damp holding cell, a harsh interrogation room, and decades inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The absolute terror of that impending reality completely broke her mind. She turned her head, frantically looking back toward the open doors of the grand ballroom. Her desperate, panicked eyes scanned the crowd of completely silent, staring investors until they finally locked directly onto me. I was standing perfectly still, just a few feet away, completely separated from the chaotic scene by a barrier of quiet, absolute authority. I did not look like the exhausted, broken, older sister she had gleefully manipulated and violently discarded. I stood incredibly tall in my immaculate black evening gown, flanked by the ruthless lead counsel of Apex Sterling Holdings. I watched her completely fall apart with the cold mechanical precision of a seasoned forensic auditor witnessing the final inevitable collapse of a highly unstable financial structure. When Jessica saw me, a fresh wave of absolute desperate hysteria washed completely over her. She ignored the federal agents actively trying to pull her up from the floor. She aggressively threw her upper body forward, fighting against the heavy steel handcuffs digging into her wrists, and she looked up at me with a face completely twisted by pure, unadulterated terror. "Harper!" she screamed, her voice cracking violently, echoing loudly through the silent marble lobby. "Harper, please!" Her voice sounded exactly like it did when we were completely impoverished children, living in a tiny, cramped apartment, relying entirely on my meager part-time wages just to survive. She was intentionally, desperately using the exact same tone she used to use when she needed me to fix her mistakes, when she needed me to pay her bills, when she needed me to sacrifice my own basic needs so she could safely thrive. For my entire adult life, that specific crying, pleading voice had been my absolute ultimate weakness. It had always triggered a deeply ingrained, desperate need to protect my younger sister at all absolute costs. But as I stood there in the cold, bright light of the hotel lobby, looking down at her kneeling on the marble floor wearing diamonds she had purchased by actively trying to send me to a federal prison, I realized something incredibly profound. That specific voice no longer held a single ounce of power over me. The invisible emotional chains she had actively used to control and manipulate my entire existence were completely, entirely broken. "Harper, please, you have to stop them." Jessica sobbed uncontrollably, her tears completely ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark black streaks running heavily down her pale face. "I am your sister. I am your family, Harper. You raised me. You cannot let them do this to me. Tell them I did not know. Tell them Marcus forced me to do it. Please, Harper, just tell them I had absolutely nothing to do with this." She was literally begging me on her hands and knees in front of the most elite, powerful people in Chicago. She was desperately deploying the absolute ultimate manipulation tactic, completely weaponizing our shared childhood history to force me to save her from the devastating consequences of her own malicious greed. She honestly believed that because we shared the same blood, I would somehow magically forget the horrific, violent reality of what she had just done to me. She believed the deeply ingrained loyalty I had carried for 28 years would somehow forcefully override the fact that she had gleefully, intentionally destroyed my entire life. I slowly walked forward. The crowd of wealthy investors collectively held their breath, completely captivated by the raw, devastating reality playing out right in front of them. The two federal agents paused their aggressive attempts to pull Jessica up from the floor, silently allowing me to carefully close the final distance between us. The heavy click of my designer heels against the polished marble floor sounded incredibly loud in the suffocating quiet of the massive room. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from where she was kneeling. I looked down at her completely ruined emerald silk gown and the heavy steel handcuffs painfully locking her arms behind her back. I looked at the dark smeared makeup, completely masking her beautiful face. And as I looked at her, waiting for the familiar heavy wave of guilt and overwhelming sisterly protection to wash over me, I realized that the deep consuming well of anger I had carried for the last 72 hours was completely, entirely gone. The raging, furious fire that had aggressively fueled my massive forensic investigation, the burning, desperate need to violently tear down her fraudulent empire. the absolute sickening betrayal that had kept me awake for 3 completely sleepless nights. All of it simply evaporated into the cold night air. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I did not feel a single ounce of triumph or vindication. I felt absolutely nothing. The space inside my chest, where my deep, unconditional love for my younger sister had lived for 28 years, was completely, entirely empty. It had been thoroughly hollowed out by her endless lies, her absolute sickening greed, and her complete lack of basic human empathy. The woman sobbing hysterically on the cold marble floor, begging desperately for my mercy, was an absolute complete stranger to me. She was just another greedy, pathetic criminal, caught desperately trying to escape the heavy, crushing weight of her own terrible actions. Jessica looked up at me, her blue eyes completely wide with a frantic, desperate hope. She saw me step closer, and she honestly believed her manipulative tears had successfully worked one final time. She believed I was going to turn around and confidently command the federal agents to release her. She believed I was going to sacrifice my own hard-earned freedom to completely take the blame for her multi-million-dollar fraud, just like I had sacrificed my entire youth to give her a better life. "Harper," she whispered again, her voice dropping to a weak, pathetic croak. "Please, save me." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream or offer a single dramatic speech for the wealthy audience silently watching us from the edges of the grand ballroom. I slowly, gracefully bent down, bringing my face completely level with hers. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal police cruisers outside washed violently across both of our faces, illuminating the absolute terrifying finality in my eyes. I leaned in incredibly close until I could actually feel the frantic, shallow heat of her panicked breath against my cheek. I looked directly into the deep center of her terrified eyes, completely dismantling the last remaining fragments of her delusional, entitled reality. "I stopped being your sister the night you threw me out in the rain." I whispered, my voice perfectly steady, completely devoid of any trace of emotion and harder than absolute solid ice. Jessica violently physically recoiled, as if my softly spoken words had physically burned her skin. Her mouth opened in a silent, devastating scream of pure, unadulterated realization. She finally completely understood that the endless well of my unconditional love and protection had officially completely run permanently dry. There were absolutely no more second chances, no more hidden safety nets, and no more older sister willing to blindly throw herself onto the tracks to save her. She was entirely, completely alone. I did not wait for her to offer another pathetic excuse. I did not wait for her to scream or beg or attempt to deploy another highly manipulative lie. I simply stood up, completely straightening my posture and entirely breaking eye contact with the woman who used to be my family. I turned my back to her with absolute smooth mechanical precision. The 2 federal agents immediately understood that the brief final interaction was completely over. They grabbed Jessica roughly by her upper arms, completely ignoring her renewed hysterical screams, and forcefully hauled her up from the cold marble floor. They did not hesitate or slow down again. They aggressively marched her straight toward the heavy glass doors, dragging her completely ruined emerald gown across the floor, directly toward the waiting, heavily armored federal transport vehicles. I did not turn around to watch her leave. I did not turn my head to see the harsh, bright lights of the local news cameras violently flashing against her tear-streaked face as the agents completely shoved her into the dark, cramped backseat of the police cruiser. I did not listen to the loud, aggressive roar of the massive engines as the federal convoy rapidly pulled away from the luxury hotel, carrying the completely destroyed architects of a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud far away into the cold, unforgiving darkness of the federal justice system. I simply kept my eyes looking firmly straight ahead, facing the absolute quiet calm of the massive hotel lobby. The incredibly heavy, suffocating weight I had unknowingly carried on my shoulders for my entire adult life, the constant, exhausting, desperate need to continuously save a sister who actively despised me, was completely, entirely lifted. The incredibly dark, terrifying storm that had violently washed me out of that stolen mansion just a few days ago was officially completely over. I stood in the center of the beautiful, quiet marble foyer, entirely surrounded by the absolute complete ruins of their deeply fraudulent empire, and for the first time in 28 long, agonizing years, I was entirely, beautifully free. 6 months have passed since the night the heavy glass doors of the grand ballroom closed behind my sister and her husband. Time has a strange, beautiful way of completely settling the dust after a massive, violent storm. The federal justice system moves incredibly fast when you hand them a perfectly packaged, totally undeniable forensic roadmap of a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. Marcus did not get to charm his way out of the courtroom. He did not get to flash his brilliant smile and manipulate the jury with his smooth, charismatic lies. He did not get to hire expensive elite defense attorneys using stolen money because every single penny he thought he possessed had been legally seized and completely repatriated to Apex Sterling Holdings. He faced a ruthless federal judge who was absolutely entirely immune to his arrogant tech visionary persona. During the lengthy trial, Marcus sat at the defense table looking incredibly small and entirely defeated, finally realizing that his massive, fragile ego had been his ultimate, devastating downfall. The evidence I provided was completely irrefutable, leaving his public defender with absolutely no viable strategy. Last month, Marcus was officially sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There are no bespoke tailored suits or imported luxury sports cars where he is going. There are no lavish high society parties or crowds of adoring wealthy investors. He will spend the next decade of his life completely stripped of all his manufactured power, living in a tiny concrete cell, perfectly aware that a woman he deeply underestimated put him there. The absolute silence of his prison cell will be a constant, agonizing reminder of the brilliant empire he lost because of his own uncontrollable greed. Jessica met a similarly devastating fate. When Marcus aggressively turned on her in the crowded hotel lobby, throwing her directly under the massive federal bus to save his own skin, she realized exactly what kind of man she had violently betrayed her own flesh and blood to protect. But her hysterical tears and her desperate manipulative victim act did not save her this time. She could not play the innocent, completely oblivious housewife, because my secure digital logs proved undeniably that she was the one actively forging my signatures and transferring the stolen capital directly from their home network. The federal government swiftly seized absolutely everything she held dear. The sprawling 6-bedroom luxury mansion, the custom-imported vehicles, the extensive designer wardrobe, and every single piece of flawless diamond jewelry she had eagerly bought using my completely ruined credit score were all rapidly auctioned off to pay massive criminal restitution. Jessica is currently living in a dark, incredibly cramped, damp studio apartment on the far dangerous edge of the city. It is a massive, catastrophic fall from grace for a woman who used to actively demand total perfection from everyone around her. To pay for her heavily mandated court-appointed legal defense, she is currently working grueling, agonizing double shifts as a waitress at a cheap 24-hour diner. Her previously perfectly manicured hands are now heavily covered in harsh calluses and deep grease burns. She spends her entirely exhausted days serving cheap, greasy food and wiping down sticky tables, constantly nervously looking over her shoulder as she actively awaits her own criminal trial for federal conspiracy. The high society elite she tried so desperately to impress have completely, entirely erased her from their selective memories. She happily traded her only loyal sister for a handful of stolen, shiny diamonds. And now, she has absolutely nothing left but the terrifying, crushing reality of an impending prison sentence. She is learning the incredibly hard, painful way that malicious actions have permanent, absolute consequences. As for me, my life looks completely, wonderfully different. The federal prosecutors officially fully cleared my name of all outstanding criminal charges, less than 48 hours after the spectacular gala. My pristine 800 credit score was completely legally restored, and the massive, terrifying weight of the fraudulent commercial loans was completely permanently erased from my public record. I did not just get my old quiet life back. I built an entirely new, incredibly powerful one. When the dust finally settled at Apex Sterling Holdings, my chief executive officer, William Sterling, called me into his massive, opulent corner office. He did not just casually thank me for saving the firm $5 million. He looked at me with deep, profound professional respect and absolute awe. He saw a strong, capable woman who could remain lethally calm under catastrophic emotional pressure and completely dismantle a highly sophisticated offshore criminal syndicate in under 72 hours. I was swiftly given a massive, unprecedented promotion to Director of Global Forensic Auditing. I now have my own expansive corner office with a beautiful panoramic view of the glorious Chicago skyline and a dedicated team of incredibly brilliant junior analysts working directly under my command. My new substantial salary completely changed my entire world, giving me a level of absolute, untouchable financial security I had never even allowed myself to dream of when I was scrubbing dirty floors and cooking hot meals for a sister who actively, deeply despised me. 3 weeks ago, I finally bought my own beautiful home. It is a quiet, peaceful house with a sprawling, lush green garden and large, bright windows that let in the warm, golden morning sun. Every single piece of comfortable furniture belongs entirely to me. Every single quiet, solitary moment is entirely fiercely mine. There are no tense, miserable dinners waiting for the next cruel, demeaning insult. There are no frantic, panicked demands for extra money or exhausting favors. There is absolutely no one making me feel incredibly small or entirely worthless. When I walk through my solid front door, I feel an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute permanent peace. It is the kind of deep, settling, beautiful peace that only comes when you finally find the incredible, unmatched courage to permanently sever the heavy, toxic ties dragging you completely down into the dark. For 28 long years, I honestly completely believed that family was defined entirely by blood. I foolishly believed that because Jessica and I shared the exact same parents, I was permanently legally obligated to protect her, excuse her endless cruelty, and completely sacrifice my own personal happiness to ensure she safely survived. I believed I had to constantly set myself completely on fire just to keep her pleasantly warm. I thought that silently enduring her emotional abuse was simply the necessary heavy price of being a good older sister. I know now that I was completely, entirely wrong. Family is absolutely not about shared genetics or biological DNA. Family is about mutual, deep respect, unyielding, fierce loyalty, and genuine, unconditional emotional care. Blood simply makes you biological relatives. Consistent, genuine, loving, protective behavior is what truly actively makes you family. I spent my entire adult life desperately trying to earn basic love from someone who only saw me as a completely disposable financial tool. The exact moment I finally stopped protecting her and actively started protecting myself, the entire beautiful world completely opened up for me. I finally truly realized that my own well-being was absolutely worth fighting for, and that powerful realization absolutely saved my life. Unconditional love should never mean unconditional tolerance for abuse. We are incorrectly taught from a very young, vulnerable age that we must always blindly forgive our family members, no matter how deeply they maliciously hurt us, or how terribly they intentionally treat us. Society loudly tells us to keep the fake peace and silently swallow our immense pain just to visually maintain the completely false illusion of a happy, perfect family. But blood does not give anyone the absolute right to use you, violently bleed you dry, and completely discard you. Setting a hard boundary isn't revenge, it is survival. You do not owe your beautiful life, your hard-earned financial security, or your precious mental health to someone who actively, purposefully tries to completely destroy yours. Walking away from deeply toxic, manipulative people, even if you share the exact same last name, is sometimes the absolute bravest, most incredibly necessary thing you will ever do in your entire life. You absolutely deserve to be surrounded entirely by people who joyfully celebrate your success, not miserable people who view your life as a convenient resource to be repeatedly stolen and selfishly exploited. You have the absolute right to fiercely protect your peace. Have you ever had to draw a permanent line with a toxic family member? Have you ever had to completely walk away from someone you truly loved because they stubbornly refused to treat you with basic human decency? Would you have let them go to prison if you were in my shoes? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. I know exactly how incredibly isolating and deeply lonely it feels to be the designated scapegoat of a deeply broken, manipulative family, and I want to hear exactly how you finally found the immense strength to finally choose yourself. If you believe in bravely standing up for yourself, please hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story about finding true justice and absolute peace. Before you go, let me know, where are you watching this video from right now, and what time is it there? Drop your city and time in the comments. Stay strong.